Chapter 1662. Danny said, "Then there's no time to lose. We'll go look for fellow Taoisti right away." After saying that, he turned around and broke through the void. In an instant he passed through countless worlds and flashed by. Then he stepped into a world. Zhang Yan waved his sleeve and kept the furnace. With a step, he also entered this world. This world was white and seemed to be empty. However, after a while, light suddenly shone. It was as if the sun had risen from the east, and all things were born. Suddenly, endless wonders appeared. Zhang Yan looked over and saw that there were hundreds of millions of people on this land, but there was not a single cultivator. Although there was a border, the people lived rich lives and enjoyed peace. It was as if all disputes and troubles had been eliminated here. It couldn't be said to be a paradise, but it could be said to be a paradise of humanity. As long as there were living things in the world, there would be conflicts. The reason why this place was like this was because there was a mighty figure working hard to maintain the order of this world. However, it must be known that this was only the manifestation of the mighty figure's will. If there came a day when this person's state of mind changed, it would probably be different. Danny took a few glances and found Michihito Ichito. He said, "Fellow Taoist, please follow me." Zhang Yan followed him. After a while, he landed on a 9-story building. The terrain here was strange and steep. It was located halfway up the mountain, and the mountain was embedded into the wall. There was a coiled plank road outside, and below it was a 1,000-foot ravine. However, the moment he arrived here, a Whaley immediately descended and restricted his mana and divine arts. Dan Yi was afraid that he would misunderstand, so he transmitted a message with his spirit. Fellow Taoist Jia is not a human cultivator. He likes to experience the joys of the human world. It's not against anyone. Zhang Yan nodded. He was sure that this was related to the cultivation method. At the level of true yang, everyone had their own cultivation method. Moreover, the other party was not a human cultivator, so he naturally had his reasons for doing so. He smiled and said, "Since I'm here as a guest, I naturally have to follow the rules of the owner of this place." At this moment, Michihito Ichito had also noticed the arrival of the two of them, and he personally stood in front of the building to welcome them. He cupped his hands and said, "Greetings, fellow Taoists." He looked at Zhang Yan and said, "You must be fellow Taoist Zhang?" Zhang Yan bowed and said, "Greetings, fellow Taoisti." After greeting each other, the three of them chatted for a while. Michihito Ichito led the two of them to the top floor and sat down. The view here was wide. With their abilities, even if they turned into their mortal bodies, they could still see a bustling city at the far end of the plank road. The two cities happened to be built on two plateaus, and their borders were steep cliffs. The only place that connected them was the plank road under their feet. Although the plank road was suspended in the air, it was extremely spacious and could allow 8 horses to run side by side. Although it was a mountain road, there was an endless stream of people coming and going. It was the turn of spring and summer, and the mountains were full of flowers and fragrant flowers. When they walked on the road, the fog was below them, and eagles and birds flew side by side. Amidst the precipitous terrain, it was a magnificent sight. Michihito Ichito called out, and someone served delicacies. Then he raised his cup to toast. After drinking a few cups, he said, "When fellow Taoist Dan Yi came to my place previously, my intention was to make a move on that demon as soon as possible. I wonder if the two of you have made up your mind?" In order to isolate the place where he lived from external disturbances, he had set up all sorts of restrictions. The inside and outside of the place were cut off, so he didn't know the outcome of this matter. Danny said, "Fellow Taoist Zhang also agreed to this, and we have already set the day to kill the demon." Michihito Ichito nodded and said, "That's good. If we are late, I'm afraid that those Khanate demons will intervene, and it will be even more difficult." As he spoke, he sighed and said, "It's a pity that I'm refining that Dharma treasure, and I can't leave for the time being. I can't join hands with the two of you to deal with that demon." Danny asked, "When will you be able to refine that Dharma treasure?" Michihito Ichito pondered for a while and said, "At least 100 years. Danny smiled and said, "Maybe it won't take that long." Maybe fellow Taoist can surround and kill that demon with me. Michihito Ichido asked curiously, why is that? Could it be that fellow Taoist has a way to help me? Danny said, it's not me, but fellow Taoist Zhang. Do you know about the elephant dragon golden cauldron? Michihito Ichido smiled and said, how can I not know about it? It's also a mystical treasure. Back in Busha Heaven, a few exalted venerables had their Dharma treasures refined from this treasure. However, I heard that it didn't want to be associated with us, so it left Busha Heaven a long time ago. Could it be that the two of you have found its whereabouts? Danny said, not only have we found it, but we have also brought it here for fellow Taoist. Zhang Yan smiled and with a thought, a golden light flashed above the pavilion, and a pill cauldron with 3 ears and 8 mouths on the back of an elephant with kuei-legged stood there. Michihito Ichido couldn't help but stand up. He went forward to sense it and said curiously, it really is the elephant dragon golden cauldron, and it's not the incarnation that I saw before. Zhang Yan smiled and said, from what fellow Taoist said, you've specially looked for this treasure before? Michihito Ichido shook his head and said with a smile, I'm not afraid of being laughed at by the two of you. In order to refine that treasure, I've also looked for this pill cauldron before, but it's a pity that this treasure is used to playing tricks. After a few fruitless attempts, I gave up on this thought. He turned around and cupped his hands together, saying, fellow Taoists, you've really helped me a lot. Danny shook his head and said, fellow Taoist, please don't say that. You've refined this treasure to deal with those innate demons. How can you bear this burden alone? We should help you. Michihito Ichido calculated for a while and said with certainty, with this pill cauldron, I'll only need 3 years at most to succeed. Why don't the two of you wait for me for 3 years? When this treasure is born, I'll bring it with the two of you to deal with that monster. Zhang Yan and Dan Yi naturally agreed. 2 people working together was very different from 3 people. Their chances of winning were greatly increased. Moreover, with the help of the treasure, he could naturally wait for 3 years. Michihito Ichido walked forward and pressed on the elephant dragon gold cauldron, moving it away. He had thousands of incarnations. Although the refining process would involve most of his vitality, it was very easy to leave an incarnation here. Zhang Yan asked, what treasure is it that fellow Taoist is refining? Michihito Ichido said, there's nothing that can't be said. Those demons are holding precious treasures in their hands. Some were born from heaven and earth, some were refined by almighty beings. We don't have anything that can compete with them, so we can only take an unconventional path. As he spoke, he spread out his hand, and an illusion of a lotus cup appeared on it. The lotus petals were full, crystal clear and moist, and there was green air flowing down from it. One could hear the sound of water flowing. The treasure was not completed yet, and what he saw was only a shadow of the future. When he was refining before, the future was still chaotic, and he could at most find a vague result after 100 years. This was also the reason why he thought he could refine it in 100 years. However, with the elephant dragon gold cauldron, everything became clear. In fact, he could borrow the help of the shadow of the future now, but it would consume a lot of vitality, so it was best to wait for the treasure to be completed. He raised the cup slightly and said, this treasure is called the Rainbow Lotus Cup. Once it's refined, it can block the demons from sensing me for a moment. Even if they have a treasure in their hands, we can still find a chance of survival from it. Zhang Yan thought for a moment and understood what he meant. In the current unfavorable situation, this was the easiest way to achieve it. He had tried to gain some understanding of these ultimate treasures when he had been discussing with Mo Tsang and the others. Even though the 4 Yuan venerates were unable to explain the origins of these treasures, it was clear that most of these ultimate treasures were unwilling to rely on others. Therefore, there was no such thing as a treasure owner. There was only a person who operated them. It was just like him and the elephant dragon gold cauldron. When they came to an agreement, they were more like allies and not master and servant. This brought about a problem. When using the treasures, they could not do it as they wished, and there was a gap that could be exploited. The Lotus Cup was a loophole. When facing powerful treasures, even a moment of hesitation could determine the outcome of the battle. When the opponent was using the treasures to deal with them, If they suddenly concealed their own chi, it would be equivalent to a pause. If the opponent wanted to find them again, they would have to adjust. Even if it was only for a moment, there would be a chance to turn things around. Michihito Ichito said solemnly, "There is another weakness here. If the demons could erase the consciousness of the treasures and use them as they wish, then this thing would be useless." Zhang Yan squinted his eyes. He was also clear about this. The treasures could try to erase the consciousness, but it was not easy to do. Even a true yang cultivator would try to avoid it, because it was no less than fighting with a peer. Once the battle started, it could not stop. If it was interrupted, then all the previous efforts would be in vain. If they wanted to fight again, they would have to start all over again. For example, the sky-concealing jade membrane had its consciousness erased by Grandmaster Huantong. However, this was only temporary. It would eventually be born again, and it might not obey the original owner. Therefore, he wanted to refine it again. Not only would it be convenient for him to use it, but it could also delay the process as much as possible. Dan Yi said in a low voice, "If the demons want to use the treasure in Busu Tian, the only way is to erase its consciousness. This is our chance." Michihito Ichito said, "If they want to completely destroy the human path, they can use this thing. I hope they have not achieved their goal yet." Dan Yi said with certainty, "It will not be that fast. Our human path cultivators have spent a lot of effort to subdue it. 1,000,000 years is definitely not enough." Michihito Ichito agreed with this judgment. If the demons did not touch this thing, it was not bad news. As long as they were prepared, they still had a chance. He sighed. "Speaking of our generation, we can move freely in the world. Unfortunately, we have not truly transcended. There is still fate above our heads. When the fate changes, there will be a catastrophe. If we can't get through it, our cultivation will be reduced to nothing." Zhang Yan said calmly, "Therefore we cannot truly transcend. In the end, we are the slaves of heaven and earth." Dan Yi nodded and said, "No matter what, the chaos of the demons is the most important thing right now." Zhang Yan said, "Dan Yi, did you find anything when you went out to look for the two missing friends?" Dan Yi said, "There are some clues, but whether we can find them or not depends on luck. We can only try our best." Zhang Yan thought for a while and said, "How about this? You can go and deal with this matter first. 3 years later, we will meet here and kill the demon together." Chapter 1663. Michito Ichito agreed with what Zhang Yan said. "Taoist Dan Yi, if you have something to do, you can go first. Once I'm done, I'll work with you too to kill the demon." Dan Yi naturally had no objections. "In that case, fellow Taoists, we will meet again in 3 years. He then raised his hand in a salute and bid his farewells. Zhang Yan wanted to discuss Tao with Michito Ichito, so he stayed. Taoist Yi had attained the Tao through the true spirit of a magical treasure. Although he was not a human cultivator, at his level, the power of his divine abilities was also very strong. Therefore, there was still a lot to learn from each other. Furthermore, he had a unique ability, which was to increase the power of a true yang cultivator's incarnation. This was the key to killing the demon. The incarnation of a true yang cultivator enjoyed the same benefits as the cultivator. Sometimes, if one didn't handle it well, the incarnation would grow and devour the original body. It was like sitting on top of a fire. Usually, one had to be careful to maintain it. If someone secretly added more power to it, it might not be able to be suppressed and it might explode. Unless one walked the Tao of emotionlessness, this would always be a problem for the cultivator. However, the Tao of emotionlessness was originally in the hands of human cultivators. People like them saw everything as their servants, so why would they teach it to others? Even those innate demons didn't learn it in their early years. If they wanted to learn it, they had to figure it out themselves. Zhang Yan guessed that this Taoist Yi was originally a transcendent artifact. Perhaps he could not only increase the power of the true yang incarnation, but he could also reduce it. The reason why he made such an inference was because the former ability could only cause trouble, and would definitely be feared by many of his peers. However, if he had the latter ability, then there might be a day when he would have to rely on him, and only then would he be able to survive. The two discussed for more than 10 days, but the topic gradually shifted to the demon. Michito Ichido said, "Taoist, please take a look." He raised his hands and opened his palms to face each other. A moment later, a ball of spiritual light floated and shadows flashed by. They were all demons that were invading the human path, slaughtering living beings and devouring the spiritual opportunity of heaven and earth. He said, "This demon is so unbridled, it must be eliminated." After taking a look, Zhang Yan was able to confirm that this demon was that demon that he'd fought in the smoke world in the past. He pondered for a moment before he said, "This demon has so many incarnations, so it definitely has many hidden dangers." Michihito Ichido smiled and said, "It's convenient for me to make a move. I've already made arrangements, but the time hasn't come, so I haven't activated it yet." Zhang Yan understood in his heart. He didn't need to look into how Michito Ichido used his methods. However, with this spy that was planted in advance, once the three of them made a move, they could cause internal and external troubles to erupt at the same time. It was indeed very likely that they could kill this demon. At the very least, they could cause it to fall into internal strife and no longer have time to care about the outside world. He pondered for a moment and said, "Taoist, you have the ability to help the incarnations of your peers. I wonder if there's a taboo in this?" Since they were going to use this method to deal with the demon, as the person who was working together with them, he had to first understand the details of this. At least, he couldn't let anything go wrong on his side. Michito Ichido said, "There's no taboo, but this will exhaust my own vitality to transfer to his body and help him succeed. However, to prevent the demon from feeling the intention, I need to reduce it from his place. This way we're born from the same source. I've been keeping an eye on this demon all these years, and it's enough to make him panic." Zhang Yan was surprised and said, "Is it really enough to take these from the incarnation?" There was a huge difference in vitality between the true young incarnation and the original body. If he wanted to reach the level of the original body, it would probably be far from enough to absorb these. Michito Ichido smiled and said, "This is just a primer. It won't be a problem as long as it's 2 true and 8 false. After all, those incarnations only want to devour the original body. Seeing that their own strength has increased, they are already wild with joy. Why would they care about these things? Moreover, in my opinion, it's not appropriate. After they become the original body, they can easily eliminate it." Zhang Yan asked again, "Will it not be a problem for you to send so many?" Michito Ichido said, "Fellow Taoist, you know that I'm just a true spirit ear. It's not convenient for me to tell you where I came from, but I can tell you that my original body is used to deal with the true young incarnation. If I use my vitality here, I can absorb it from the sea of vitality at any time, and there's no need to worry about it being deficient. However, if I use it in a battle, I won't be able to do so. This is the limit of heaven, and I really can't go against it." Zhang Yan nodded to show that he understood. Although Michito Ichido had also obtained a great fortune, he was still limited by his background. If he fought with his peers head-on, he might be a little weaker. However, if he were to deal with the incarnation, he could use all his strength. With such a flaw, it was no wonder that he hid here and did not show himself. Because in a one-on-one fight, he might not be a match for any one of them. If he wanted to completely get rid of this limitation, he would have to reincarnate and cultivate again. However, being able to cultivate the true yang in this life was already a great fortune. If he wanted to redo it, it would be the same as fighting with the living beings of the myriad worlds for the opportunity to achieve Tao. It was almost impossible. There was another way, and that was to climb to the upper realm. Unfortunately, Michito Ichido had never seen an upper realm cultivator, and he didn't know how to reach that step. Michito Ichido said, "I heard that fellow Taoist seems to be able to calculate where the real body of your peers is?" Zhang Yan did not hide this, because once he fought with the demons, it was not difficult to detect this, regardless of whether it was the enemy or the demon. He said, "There is such a method, but if I calculate where the real body is, it won't be impossible for it to not sense it." Michito Ichido thought for a while and said cautiously, Fellow Taoist, can you let me try the method? Zhang Yan looked up and said seriously, Fellow Taoist, are you sure about it? True Yang cultivators only used their incarnations when they traveled outside, including Emot Song and the other three. They were not their real bodies, so even if they were destroyed, it would not be a loss. However, once the real body was calculated, it would be different. It meant that you could no longer escape from the person's sight. If the person had evil intentions, although they might not be able to kill you, it would be enough to be a great threat. Even the innate demons did not know about this, but they knew how to avoid it. It was obvious that they were guarding against it. Taoist said solemnly, Fellow Taoist, if you have this technique, there might be others who have it as well. I've decided to give it a try because I want to see if there's a way to guard against it, so that I won't be caught unprepared if I encounter it in the future. From his point of view, this method was really terrifying. If he was found one day, it would be really difficult for him to get rid of it. Now that he had seen it, he could not solve it, but at least he could try to avoid it. Seeing that he was determined, Zhang Yan did not say anything more and said, sorry for the offense. He felt the presence of Michito Ichido's chi movement in front of him, so he searched for it. At the same time, he saw a blade ray that looked like it was made of rainbow light lingering on the sea of vitality. The blade seemed endless, but when he looked at it again, it suddenly became extremely thin, as small as a grain of sand. It seemed to be able to penetrate through all the openings, showing the positive and negative changes, and the wonderful use of the two extremes. Michito Ichido's expression was solemn. Just now, he had tried a few methods, but he could not avoid it. He knew that he could not avoid it now, so he bowed and said, Thank you, fellow Taoist, for helping me. Zhang Yan retracted his supernatural power and said, You're too polite. Michito Ichido thought for a while, and then said, Fellow Taoist, if I avoid it, I can still deal with it? Zhang Yan smiled and nodded, That's right. The battle between us is actually a battle of vitality. At that time, we will see who is more brilliant. Michito Ichido's heart relaxed a little. If that was the case, the result was not as bad as he imagined, at least there was still a chance to avoid it. Zhang Yan saw his expression and knew that he was thinking about the method to avoid it, so he did not disturb him anymore. But he knew that this was destined to be fruitless. If it was so easy to find the flaws of the Tai Ming ancestral master's method, it would not have been passed down. After leaving this world, he returned to the Tianqing Hall. Time passed, and soon a few months had passed. On this day, Jingyu came to report, Master, there's a letter from the sect. Zhang Yan took it and took a look, and it was sent by Qi Yuntian. Previously, he found a few worlds that were flourishing with spiritual vigor, and he also set up the heaven and earth gates one by one. Under the leadership of the Qinsong school, various sects in the 9 continents sent cultivators there, and now they almost occupied the mountains that were flourishing with spiritual vigor. However, during this period, he accidentally found another world that seemed to have spiritual vigor. Because this place was not originally within the range of his chi, he only put the sky nail in it, so that he would not miss it in the future. At the same time, he wanted to set up another realm gate here to make it convenient for both sides to travel. He was also happy to see this happen. Once the realm gate was opened, this place would naturally be under his rule. He sensed in his heart and found the location of the sky nail. Looking in, he found that this world was already at a time when spiritual vigor was declining. There were also cultivators here, but as the world changed, they gradually lost their divine abilities. At this rate, in a few hundred years, they would be no different from mortals. However, this world had been watered with spiritual vigor for billions of years. Although it was no longer like it was in the past, there were still many spiritual things in some of the worlds. Even if they were left here, they would only slowly disappear, so it was better to take them to the mountain and sea realm. He flicked his finger, and the world suddenly shone with spiritual light, and then a 30,000-meter tall gate appeared. At the same time, above the great pool of Dragon Lake, a heaven and earth gate was propped up. There were already tens of thousands of people waiting there, and most of them were the mystic cultivators of the eastern wasteland. In the beginning, they were divided into 2 groups about going to the other worlds. One group supported it, and the other group was worried about it. afraid that it would exhaust the power of the eastern wasteland. But now no one brought it up. The Ling Sky realm was a flourishing world of spiritual vigor, and they didn't think much of it. But in other worlds, with the exception of a small portion of the medicinal herbs harvested to be given to the Qinsong school, they could keep the rest. Not only that, the sects of the 9 continents did not restrict them from teaching. It could be foreseen that in the future, there would only be more and more mystic cultivators, and their power would only increase. Under such circumstances, the countries would even want to occupy a few more worlds. At this moment, seeing that the realm gate was open, these people no longer hesitated, and under the leadership of a few great mystic cultivators, they swarmed in. Zhang Yan didn't pay any attention to this. He scanned the surroundings with his divine sense again, and when he saw that there were no traces of fiendish demons in the surroundings of this world, he withdrew his gaze and sat in meditation, waiting for the time to slay the fiendish demons to arrive. Chapter 1664. Zhang Yan sat in the hall and watched the words of his peers in meditation. With the use of the divine will, he could even recreate the scenes of that day. It was like watching from the side, and he could gain a deeper understanding from it. But suddenly, a wave of palpitation arose in his heart, and it disturbed all of these, causing these scenes to suddenly shatter. He couldn't help but open his eyes, and he knew that this wasn't without reason. There was definitely an unforeseen event that was sufficient to affect him somewhere. Hence, after thinking for a while, he started to search and observe the world, observing the past and the future. Not long after, he got the answer. His eyes flickered and he realized that it was not good news. He thought to himself, "Fate is indeed unpredictable. I wonder if there will be any changes in the killing of the demon this time." But no matter what, there was no reason to overturn what had been decided before. It was true that the situation in the outside world was changing, but his body was also changing. Now, he was cultivating in the void primordial sea with the remnant jade, and his ability to control the vitality could be said to be 1,000 miles a day. When the day of killing the demon arrived, his strength should increase by another level. If his strength increased enough to deal with these accidents, then everything would not be a problem. Thinking of this, he put these things aside for the time being and continued to meditate. 2 years passed in the blink of an eye. One day, the qi in his body seemed to be stirred, and he suddenly woke up. When he looked outside, his eyes became sharp. The appointed time had arrived, and it was time to rush to meet up with them. With a thought, another world was formed in the void primordial sea. He immediately stood up, and with a wave of his robe sleeves, he stepped into it and stood above the void sky. However, after a few breaths, as 2 majestic qi emerged, Dan Yi and Michihito Ichido also arrived one after another. Both of them looked serious. It was not easy to deal with a true young mighty figure, no matter how meticulous the plan was, and no matter how easy it was said to be. Even if there was a loophole in one of the links, it could lead to a deviation in the outcome. After the 3 of them greeted each other, Zhang Yan first said, "Taoist Yi, have you refined that magic artifact?" Taoist Yi did not make any movements, but he was already holding a green lotus cup in his hand. It was even more exquisite and gorgeous than the one he had seen before. The lotus petals were unfolded, and the sound of clear spring water flowing was like the soft hum of an immortal, extremely pleasing to the ears. As a white mist curled up from the edge of his mouth, it swayed upwards and turned into a canopy that covered the entire sky. Zhang Yan sensed for a while and felt that as soon as his qi came into contact with the canopy, everything seemed to disappear, but in the next moment, it appeared again. This was the same as what Michihito Ichido said previously. Blocking the qi's qi appeared and disappeared from time to time, and there was no fixed pattern. However, if it was used well, it was more difficult to deal with than maintaining a certain state. Michihito Ichido turned his hand, and 2 petals fell from the lotus cup. They each flew into Zhang Yan and Dan Yi's hands, and he said, "With this lotus petal in hand, when fighting, I can take the lead in blocking the qi's qi, but it can also be decided by the 2 of you." Zhang Yan nodded his head and kept the flower petal. Michihito Ichido said, "Although I've been refining the magic artifact for the past 2 years, I've also been paying attention to the movements of the demon avatar. Now I can be sure that it has something to do with the Khanate demons. A few days ago, it sent many demons to the world heaven created by Taoist Huan Tong. In order to prevent those Khanate demons from noticing my traces, I didn't get close. I don't know what they want to do. Zhang Yan thought for a while and said, a few years ago, those Khanate demons gathered various demon tribes in an attempt to spread the Tao and reverse the universe, so that all the demons in the world would stand above humanity. Coincidentally, I's avatar went there, so I destroyed all of them. It seems that they haven't given up yet. Michihito Ichido said, I see. It seems that they also know that it's not that easy to destroy humanity. The void primordial sea was vast and endless, and humans were the spirits of heaven and earth. As long as the void primordial sea did not collapse, it would not be completely destroyed. However, it could block the path of humanity. If a human cultivator did not have a single true yang, or if the external objects of cultivation were taken away by the demons, and the cultivation method could not be passed down, then the outcome would be completely different. Dan Yi pondered for a while and said, there are countless demons in the world. Even if Taoist Huan Tong killed billions of them, I'm afraid they wouldn't care about it. They would only continue to do the same thing unless they keep an eye on it. However, after they suffered a loss once, they wouldn't let others get away with it easily. Zhang Yan also understood this, but since he ran into it, he naturally wouldn't let it go. Moreover, he had also caused trouble for them. He said, speaking of this, I just now felt something. This is the shadow of the future, please take a look. He waved his sleeves and suddenly, the scenery around them changed. Dan Yi and Michihito Ichido found themselves in a dilapidated temple. A disheveled old man with a face full of fear was half kneeling on the ground. In his arms was a child of 2 to 3 years old. At the same time, there was a little demon that was half human and half demon that was scolding and beating him, seemingly wanting him to hand over the child for blood sacrifice to the temple master. The statue of a god was enshrined on the altar. It was majestic, holding a whip in one hand and a hammer in the other. It wore silver armor, but above it were 2 ferocious tiger heads. Zhang Yan glanced at it and walked out. Dan Yi and Michihito Ichido also followed him out. When they walked out of the temple, they saw a horizontal board hanging on the temple door. There were 3 strange words written on it. However, with their ability, they could naturally see the original words and immediately recognized that it was the temple of the tiger deity. After leaving the temple, they walked down the mountain along a dirt road. At the foot of the mountain, there were a few dilapidated villages. Still, in these villages, be it men or women, old or young, they were all in rags, crawling back and forth on the muddy ground like livestock. Every one of them had a collar around their neck, and the ones leading them were all demons with demon heads and human bodies. With Zhang Yan leading the way, in just a short period of time, the 3 of them had walked through more than half of the continent. However, Dan Yi and Michihito Ichido found that this place had long been dominated by demons. The living people were only the demons' rations and slaves. They did not have words, did not know etiquette, and all of them had dull expressions. Their eyes were dull and their eyes were dull. They usually lived in places that were filthy with feces and urine, and were even worse than ordinary animals. Not only that, in the sects here, the cultivators were all demons. When they were born, there would be great demons to open their spiritual wisdom and teach them etiquette and language. Shape-shifting was originally from a demon to a human. If one wanted to cultivate Tao, this was unavoidable. However, those great demons deliberately left some traces of demons, and even spread it everywhere. This was the natural difference between humans and demons. Because the living people could not shapeshift, they were even more stupid, so they could not cultivate Tao from birth. They were the lowest of the low, destined to only be used for food and entertainment. In this world, there were only a few unknown places where knowledge and words were passed down. However, they could only hide in the deep mountains and forests, painstakingly maintaining the inheritance of their ancestors, and did not dare to come out. Moreover, they did not know Tao techniques and supernatural powers, and could at most deal with the wild beasts in the mountains and forests. Any slightly stronger demon could easily destroy them. What was even more tragic was that even they themselves did not know that their existence was actually intentionally left behind by the fiendish demons so that they could be destroyed when the fiendish demons improved. In the eyes of these demonic cultivators, they were merely there to seek entertainment. The people of this place had already sunk into darkness and ignorance. After seeing this, Michihito Ichido did not say anything and only shook his head. He was not a human cultivator, and fighting against the demons was only out of consideration for himself. However, he usually liked to live in the secular world, and he liked prosperity and happiness, so he was very disgusted with the scene in front of him. Dan-E frowned, and his heart was extremely heavy. Although what he saw here was only the scene of this world, in the future, perhaps it was not only this void realm. It was possible that the same scene was playing out in all the worlds in the universe. He knew that Bu-Shu-Tien or somewhere in the void primordial sea, something important that he did not know must have happened, and it could affect the future. While there were many changes in the future, if he did not do anything now, then it was very likely that this would happen, unless the resistance was strong enough to reverse the situation. He looked up and asked, "May I ask, do you know how many years later this will happen?" Zhang Yan thought for a while, then said, "I am not sure, but I have this feeling occasionally." Michihito Ichido pondered, to be able to cause such a feeling, the change must not be small. Zhang Yan said, "Since you do not know, then don't worry about it for now. Kill the red rat demon first, then come back to find out the whole story." Dan-E was silent for a while, then said firmly, "Yes, as long as we can kill those demons and take Bu-Shu-Tien back, then all of this will not happen." Zhang Yan said, "Fellow Taoist Dan-E said that he had found some clues regarding the whereabouts of those two Taoists. Did you find anything after searching for them?" Dan-E shook his head. "At first, it was a little smooth, but the more I searched, the more uncertain it became. However, until the day when the demons are free, I will continue to search." Zhang Yan nodded. "I have nothing to worry about here, so I can go and subdue the demons at any time. How are the two of you?" Michihito Ichido said, "I have already prepared here." Dan-E looked at him and said, "Just now using the shadow of the future, you must have consumed a lot of vitality. Do you want to recover a little before going to look for that demon?" Zhang Yan agreed, and at the same time, his main body on the sea of vitality was already collecting his vitality. In reality, his vitality was vast, so this loss was nothing, but who knew what the demon was capable of? Moreover, the other Khanate demons were in cahoots, so they might have some powerful tricks up their sleeves. Sometimes, a little carelessness could lead to defeat and death. He clearly knew this, so the best strategy was to make sure that he did not have any flaws. Even if there was only one possibility in a million, he would not leave the enemy. However, after a while, his eyes flashed and he said, "We can go." Taoist E could not help but look at him. Although he did not know how many years had passed, he was sure that it had been a long time. The amount of yuan qi consumed in this process was massive. Even though he knew that the latter had a strong foundation, the fact that he was able to recover in such a short period of time was enough to surprise everyone. Dan Yi's voice became solemn and he said, "Since both of you are ready, then we will go and kill that demon." Chapter 1665. Zhang Yan and the other two had already locked onto the demon's aura. Now, no matter where it was, as long as it wasn't hiding in Bu-Shu-Tien's body, it would be easy for them to find it. But if that was the case, they would only be able to find its incarnation before it was destroyed. The true body would not be affected at all, and at most it would lose some of its vitality. If the true body needed it, it could create a new incarnation out of thin air. If it wasn't afraid of being devoured in the future, it wouldn't be difficult for it to create hundreds or thousands of incarnations. If the true body of a true young cultivator hid in the sea of vitality, then there were very few things that could threaten them. But it wasn't that there was no way. For example, Zhang Yan could calculate the location of the true body of a true young cultivator. When Dan-E first learned of this, he was also very surprised, and when Michihito Ichido learned of this, he was even more shocked. True young cultivators of the same generation would usually avoid each other, but with this kind of magical power, as long as they could capture their aura or avatars, they could kill them at any time, so he naturally didn't feel at ease. Zhang Yan didn't think much of it. Even if he could find the true location of a true yang cultivator, he still needed to exhaust its vitality before he could truly kill it. In the end, it still depended on the strength of both sides. No matter how powerful the spell was, it still depended on the person using it. There was no such thing as an unbreakable spell in the world. For example, those Xiantian demons had avoided him when he tried to probe them. Although he hadn't used his full strength, he believed that they wouldn't be so simple. The key was that this secret technique had opened a clear path for him, allowing him to move forward. Once he familiarized himself with it, he might be able to improve his magical power to the next level. Aside from finding the true body, there was actually another way to force a true yang cultivator into a desperate situation, and that was to use their incarnations. This was one of the most common techniques that true yang cultivators would use in battle when they didn't use precious treasures. Although it didn't seem like there was any intense fighting going on, the truth was that it was just as dangerous. In fact, because it was a hidden technique, it was sometimes impossible to tell who had plotted against them when it was used. The three of them chose to use this plan. According to the plan they had discussed, they would first instigate the monster's avatar to cause trouble. If the avatar devoured the original body, then it would go through a process of yuan qi from life to death and reincarnation. In such a situation, the monster would not be able to fight back. At that time, Zhang Yan would use the secret technique to find its location and kill it. Even if this plan failed, the main body would still be able to suppress the incarnation. Then, it would be equivalent to them having a helper who could help them exhaust their opponent's vitality. No matter what, they would not be at a disadvantage. Michihito Ichido closed his eyes and sensed for a while. He immediately found a target. His expression became extremely serious as he said, "Gentlemen, I'll start now." This was the battle of the true yang. Before it ended, no one knew how many realms would be affected. Even because of the subconscious mobilization of spiritual vigor and vitality, no matter which side was defeated, many realms that were covered by their chi dynamic might decline due to the exhaustion of spiritual vigor. No one knew how many living beings would die. Danny said, "I've already seen that the world where this monster's chi dynamic is located has long been destroyed. There are no human cultivators. Moreover, this guy is still devouring spiritual vigor everywhere. Obviously, he's preparing to escape to Busu Tian in the future. He doesn't want to stay in the void primordial sea anymore. You don't have to worry too much." Zhang Yan stood with his sleeves behind his back and didn't say anything. The true yang was the ruler of the myriad worlds. Since he had decided to take action, some things were inevitable. Michihito Ichido didn't wait any longer. With a thought, he sent a trace of vitality into the avatar that he had sensed. If he wanted to provoke the avatar to cause trouble, he couldn't just send the vitality into it. That would be too crude. Moreover, the monster could easily find out that someone was plotting against it. He couldn't make it too obvious from the start. His method was to first guide the avatar to absorb vitality from the sea of primordial chi. Although the avatar was independent of the original body and was an independent individual, because it came from the same source, it shared the benefits with the original body. This action was actually stealing what originally belonged to the original body. In a certain world, a monster with a goat's head and a human body was sleeping soundly. Although the original body was a red rat, every incarnation of the true yang great demon was different. It could be said that it had a myriad of forms. If the incarnation became the ruler, it would no longer be its original appearance. It would be a different person inside and out. It was originally lying there, but all of a sudden, its body shook, and it woke up abruptly. Then, it vigilantly observed its surroundings and even the passing of the world. Naturally, this would not yield any results, but it felt that its vitality seemed to be more active than before, and its dharmakaya had also become slightly stronger. These changes caused an intense desire to arise in its heart. It wanted to absorb even more origin chi to replenish itself. In the past, it was fearful and could only steal bit by bit. But today, it couldn't suppress this thought no matter what, so it might as well toss aside everything and start absorbing greedily. Seeing this, Michihito Ichido knew that there was no need to continue paying attention here. He decisively withdrew his senses and immediately went to find his next target. And just a moment after he withdrew, a thought descended and swept over the avatar. Fortunately, it was a magic treasure that targeted the true young avatar, so it was difficult for others to detect it when he secretly acted. Moreover, it had retreated in time, so it didn't catch any traces of it. The monster glanced coldly at the incarnation that was desperately sucking in the origin chi, but it did not kill it. This was because the more killing intent it had, the easier it would produce more incarnations. That would only be losing the bigger picture for the sake of a small gain. Moreover, because it had sent out an avatar to invade the Void Realm, it caused the number of avatars to increase greatly, and it continuously strengthened several times. If it suddenly targeted one of them, it would only make the situation worse. Only by provoking the avatars to fight each other would there be no hidden dangers left, and it wouldn't arouse the others' vigilance. After watching for a while, it withdrew its gaze. These avatars were now difficult to return to, and it was quite troubled. If it wasn't for the innate demons in Busu Tion promising to help him solve this matter in the future, he wouldn't dare to do so. As for now, before the situation completely collapsed, he could only let it be. Michihito Ichido went down to several worlds, and successively made a move on the 4 demon avatars. At this point, he didn't continue, but withdrew his consciousness and said, "Next, we need to wait." Zhang Yan and Dan Yi nodded. They also roughly understood the steps here. After the 4 avatars had absorbed enough vitality, they would definitely go around killing other people of the same generation, and then they would devour each other again under Michihito Ichido's method, until they turned into one, and then challenged the strongest avatar. This was actually what the demon was happy to see, but it would never have thought that Michihito Ichido would let the avatar take the initiative to integrate into it, so that the strength of the avatar would rise to a level where the original body had to suppress it. The two would definitely fight before, and that would be the best time for them to make their move. The 3 of them watched, and not long after, the 4 avatars all moved, and according to what they thought, they killed the other avatars, and devoured their vitality to strengthen themselves. Dan Yi thought for a moment and said, "This is indeed a good plan, but I hope there are no mistakes in it. If this plan went smoothly, then they could weaken this enemy to the greatest extent, and they could also kill it with the least cost." Michihito Ichido said, "No one can be sure until the last moment, but I have been watching this demon for more than 100,000 years, and set up a lot of methods. Even if this doesn't work, I can use other methods to replace it." He paused and said, "If we can't kill it this time, then we won't be able to find such a good opportunity in the future." Dan Yi nodded in agreement. Now that there was Michihito Ichido in front of them, and they had the advantage in numbers, it could be said that they had an absolute advantage. Moreover, if they still couldn't kill this demon, even if they could only let it escape, it would be a failure. Michihito Ichido turned to look at Zhang Yan, and saw that he seemed to be thinking, so he thought that the latter had found something wrong. He did not dare to be careless, and asked solemnly, "Fellow Taoist Zhang, is there something that I did not consider thoroughly?" Zhang Yan shook his head and smiled and said, "That's not the case. It's just that I was thinking, there are still very few things that we can borrow power from. If there's a chance, can we refine this demon into a treasure?" Michihito Ichido was stunned, then he thought for a while, and shook his head, and said, "If we can suppress this demon and take its vitality, it's indeed possible, but it's a pity that it's very difficult to do." There was a hint of regret in his voice. Using the full vitality of a true young cultivator to refine a magic tool was not inferior to some supreme treasures. However, as he had said, it was not easy to kill a true young cultivator, let alone suppress one. Zhang Yan's gaze darkened a little. He also understood this principle. In reality, if the plan was right and the 3 of them worked together, they might be able to accomplish this. However, he knew that even if they managed to capture this monster, refining it into an artifact was not something that could be done in a day. It might take tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years. There were only 200 to 300 years until the Khanate demon was released, and by then, they would need to attack Busu Tion. There was not enough time, so he did not mention this matter before. But just now, he had an inexplicable feeling as if there was a turning point. But this might not come true. Perhaps if they overlooked something, they would miss this opportunity. All they could do now was to wait. The three of them watched silently from the outside. After about 5 years, the 4 incarnations that Michihito Ichido had tampered with gradually became stronger because they had killed many other incarnations of the same origin, and the vitality they absorbed was much more than before. However, the demon had been enduring and did not interfere. Obviously, it hoped that the incarnations would kill each other, and in the end, all of them would be defeated. At this time, Michihito Ichido suddenly looked over and said, "Soon, if this step succeeds, then our plan will be more than half completed." Chapter 1666. After Zhang Yan and the other 2 watched from the outside for more than a year, the battle between the 4 demon incarnations gradually became more and more intense. Soon, the outcome would be decided. During this period, they were constantly drawing vitality from the sea of vitality to replenish themselves. This behavior was actually stealing the resources of the original body, causing a great burden to the red rat demon. The only way to avoid it was to kill it. However, in order not to produce more incarnations, it could only choose to ignore it. Not long after, one of the bird-winged beast-headed avatars tore apart the other 3 avatars one by one and swallowed all the remaining yuan qi. Then, it gradually retracted its wings, leaving behind only its arms and legs. Although it still had the head of a beast, it was more like a human. Seeing this, Michihito Ichido's expression became slightly solemn. He calculated in his heart, but he was slightly relieved. He said, "There is still a little bit of my thought sense in this incarnation. As long as I guide it a little, it can be done." Devouring the same kind was not a simple replenishment of qi, nor was it a superposition of power in the general sense. It was more like a leap in one's own level, which was a kind of earth-shaking change. With such a beast head incarnation, it could already know some good and bad luck, and it was extremely sensitive to danger. If Michihito Ichido hadn't added a method to it when it was weak, it would not have been able to affect it at this moment. Perhaps it would have sensed it as soon as the external qi came. Dan E observed it for a while and asked, "Fellow Taoist, are you sending this incarnation to fight now?" Michihito Ichido said, "There is no need for me to do that. The red rat demon has been troubled by the disaster of incarnations for a long time. Among them, the most powerful incarnation is even stronger than the one in front of us. Moreover, all of them are absorbing vitality without any scruples. How can it give them a chance to slowly grow? It will definitely find a way to provoke internal strife. Next, we just need to watch." Because he did not deliberately drive it, the incarnation was not in a hurry to act. If the previous incarnations only acted according to their instincts, then with the great increase in strength, they also became much more intelligent. They knew that they were still slightly weaker than the strong enemy, and they still needed to wait and accumulate strength. In the next year, the incarnation was absorbing vitality, and other than that, there was no movement. From the looks of it, if no one came to disturb it, it might be able to continue. Although they waited for a long time, Zhang Yan and Danny did not say anything, nor did they show any impatience. Since this matter was handed to Michihito Ichido to handle, they should trust him. Fortunately, Michihito Ichido's judgment was not wrong. In the second year, the red rat demon was the first to become a little impatient. Within the primordial void, a certain qi activity suddenly circulated. If this power was released, it would be enough to destroy a myriad of worlds. The 3 of them had been staring at this qi activity, so they immediately sensed it. They looked over and saw a cloud of yellow smoke suddenly leap over from countless worlds. It suddenly appeared in front of the beast head incarnation, and before the latter could react, it swallowed it in one gulp. Zhang Yan's eyes flickered slightly. In that instant, the red rat was actually able to send an incarnation that was not much different from him to this place. Its ability to control vitality could be said to be quite impressive. Not only that, there was also something to be learned about the mysteries of luck. He saw the entire process and secretly remembered it. He thought in his heart, Although the red rat demon's vitality is not strong, and it doesn't seem to know how to avoid chi activity, it has after all reached the true young stage for a long time. It naturally has its own merits. Michito Ichido's spirit was lifted, and he said with a smile, "You too, it can't wait to make a move. Look at that cloud of yellow smoke. That's the incarnation that disturbed the red rat demon, and it's also the strongest among its many incarnations." Zhang Yan focused his attention for a moment. The cluster of yellow smoke did not seem to have any shape on the surface, but if one took a closer look, one would see that it was a thick and long worm. Its entire body was covered with fine tentacles, and the thin smoke was being emitted from its body. There were several large mouths at its front that were constantly opening and closing, giving it an exceptionally ferocious appearance. However, although it had swallowed the beast head, it was unable to suppress it. Although there was a difference between the two incarnations, they were already at the same level. Even the originally weaker one could not be easily eliminated. Danny changed his mind. According to the plan, this should be the time for the two incarnations to merge. However, when he saw that Michito Ichido did not make a move, he asked, "Fellow Taoist, when are you going to make a move?" Michito Ichido thought for a while and said, "Wait a little longer. When the two of them fight, they also need to draw vitality from the sea of vitality. Right now, it's still too early to determine the winner, so we can take this opportunity to exhaust the demon's strength." Danny said, "I'm afraid that the red rat demon also has some means to counterattack." Michito Ichido said, "Fellow Taoist consideration is not unreasonable. At this moment, the red rat demon is watching from the side, but all it can do is help the weak attack the strong. Otherwise, the stronger the strong, the more it will become, the more it will fall into a dead end. It's just that under my arrangements, the outcome of the incarnation has long been determined, so no matter what it does, it will be useless." Seeing that he was full of confidence, Danny said, "It's good that you know what you're doing." Michito Ichido said with a smile, "Fellow Taoist, don't worry. At this point, it's already very difficult for the demon to make a comeback. What we really need to be wary of is that the demon will suddenly feel something and pry into the future. However, if it really does that, its vitality will definitely be exhausted. If I notice it, I will naturally make a move in advance." At this moment, in the battlefield, the aura of the two incarnations collided fiercely. After fighting for more than 100 days, the beast-headed incarnation's foundation was slightly weaker, and it gradually showed signs of being unable to endure. At this moment, the red rat demon, who was watching from the side, made a move. It secretly sent some vitality over, and the beast-headed incarnation gained some nourishment and slightly perked up. For the red rat demon, the best result would be for the incarnation to swallow the former. Like a snake swallowing an elephant, it would take a very long time to absorb the vitality that it had seized. As long as it could delay for a few hundred years, Bu Su Tian would no longer have a forbidden formation, and it would be able to hide in it. At that time, these problems would no longer be a problem. Another 10 days passed, during which time the red rat demon sent vitality 3 times. Although the movements were not obvious, the long worm finally realized that something was wrong. At this moment, it also knew that it could not hide it anymore, so it drew a large mass of vitality from the sea of vitality and poured it into the beast-headed incarnation. After the latter accepted it, its aura skyrocketed and rose steadily. In just a moment, it was almost equal to the long worm. Michihito Ichido's expression froze and he said, "Now is the time." He took out a seal, and when the beast-headed incarnation's aura reached its peak, its body suddenly trembled and then exploded into countless strands of vitality. It actually took the initiative to fuse with the long worm's incarnation. The latter naturally did not hesitate. In an instant, dozens of large mouths split open on its body and swallowed with all its might. The red rat demon originally hoped that the beast-headed incarnation would be able to turn defeat into victory, but he never expected such a situation to occur. He was also shocked. How could he not understand that he had fallen into a trap? However, he did not expect that someone would come to kill him. He only thought that someone was playing tricks behind his back. He was also decisive. He immediately mobilized a large amount of vitality, and then he saw the world where the longworm's incarnation was dyed dark red. At this moment, the world seemed to have become a thin bubble, as if it could burst with a gentle poke. It was playing a trick, preparing to erase this place along with the incarnation. However, if it wanted to kill such a powerful incarnation, it could be said to be endless trouble in the future. In an instant, as its killing intent surged, more incarnations were born where the aura was, and they were all extremely powerful. This was just like Rong Sun. Ordinary people tried to forget something, but the more they tried to do so, the more they could not forget it. Although the situation was different, the principle was the same. The red rat demon knew this, but if this incarnation successfully swallowed the vitality, it would immediately become powerful and would definitely challenge the real body. Therefore, it could not care so much anymore. At this moment, Michihito Ichido said, "Fellow Taoist Zhang, please make your move." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. He raised his palm, and in an instant, the shadow of the void-concealing jade membrane appeared in his hand. The treasure only flashed, and the dark red color completely retreated as if it had never appeared in the first place. He had borrowed that thread of future to activate this treasure and diverted all of the red rat's magic power to an unknown place. Of course, in order to do this, he had to expend more vitality than his opponent. However, his vitality was incomparably abundant, far surpassing that of the demon. It was just that he did not need to care about these losses. With this thread of relief, the incarnation of the long worm swallowed all the vitality in the field and immediately became fate energy. With a shake of its body, it turned into an elegant young man, but his face was pale and his eyes were red, making him look slightly demonic. The red rat demon was startled. Only now did he know that the enemy had been lying in ambush, but before he could find the enemy, the young man's eyes flashed, and he leaped into the sea of vitality, facing the real body. He laughed at the sky and said, "Today, it's time for me to succeed." There was a flash of light in the sea of vitality, and a gloomy middle-aged cultivator in a black robe and red sash walked out. It was the real body of the red rat demon. He said in a low voice, "The enemy is outside, and you come to make things difficult for me?" The young man laughed and said, "Jiangong, that is the enemy you provoked, not my enemy, so what does it have to do with me?" Jiangong snorted and said, "Without the skin, what can the hair attach to? You are only my incarnation. If someone wants to kill me, why would they let you go?" The young man suddenly had a ruthless expression and said, "I don't know about this, I only know that you want to kill me just now. Even if I retreat, you will not let me go in the future. If that is the case, why don't you let me get rid of you first, then maybe I will have some chance of survival. If you really want to take care of the big picture, then obediently let me swallow you, and I will take care of the people outside for you." There was nothing Jiangong could do. These avatars were born from distracting thoughts, and they contained all kinds of desires. It was impossible to reason with them, so he could only stop after killing them. Thus, he didn't say anything else. Instead, he circulated his magic power and the surrounding origin energy flowed into his body. The young man laughed, "I was waiting for you." In the midst of his laughter, there was also a large amount of vitality that flowed into his body. Chapter 1667. Although Ji Yangong and the young man had yet to really fight, the worlds under his rule had already started to collapse under the violent chi dynamic. Michito Ichido sensed for a long time and said happily, "Very good. Just now, the incarnation has already leaped into the sea of vitality where the red rat demon's real body is. The two are now fighting fiercely. No matter who wins or loses, it will benefit me." Danny said, "The incarnation just now, it may not be a match for the real body. Fellow Taoist, do you think we should make a move now or wait a little longer?" Although the three of them had participated in all the planning, the specific arrangements were mainly made by Michito Ichido. Now that the plan had succeeded without any oversight, they wanted to hear his judgment. Michito Ichido thought for a while and said, "In my opinion, both sides are entangled in a fight and need to consume a large amount of vitality at every moment. Why don't we wait here and attack when the incarnation weakens? There's no hurry." Danny thought for a while, then turned around and asked, "What do you think, fellow Taoist Zhang?" Zhang Yan thought for a while. Michito Ichito's previous arrangements were not bad, but this time, he was a little conservative. However, this was also his style. He liked to plan before he acted, and only went into battle when he was more confident. However, he felt that this was not the time to sit and watch, but to take the initiative to attack. He looked up and said, "I think that at this time, we should press forward and not let the Red Rat Demon and the Incarnation fight." Dan E asked seriously, "May I ask, fellow Taoist, what is the reason?" Zhang Yanyan said, "If the Red Rat Demon was alone, he would be in a terrible situation with just one doppelganger. But don't forget that there's still a Khanate demon behind him. He might have a way to restrain his doppelgangers. Previously, this demon has been invading everywhere without caring about the number of doppelgangers. If he dares to do so, he must have something up his sleeves. If we don't do anything and the doppelgangers are destroyed, it won't be that easy to kill this demon." Danny thought that this made sense. After discussing with Michito Ichito for a while, he asked, "Then, fellow Taoist Zhang, do you think that we should fight our way out now?" Zhang Yan said, "There's no need. Both of you know that I can calculate the location of my peer. When I cast my spell, it will definitely feel it. In order to not let I get close and kill its vitality source, it will have to find a way to avoid me. In this way, it will be distracted and it will not be able to focus." Dan E and Michito Ichito nodded. This plan did not require them to fight their way out immediately, but it could also divert most of the Red Rat Demon's attention so that it would not dare to relax. It was indeed a good plan. However, they could all see that there was still a problem in this. Danny looked up and asked solemnly, "Fellow Taoist Zhang, this method will consume a lot of your vitality. If it drags on for a long time, it might not be a good thing. Do you have confidence?" They also knew that in a battle between two true young cultivators, the one who took the initiative to chase would expend more energy than the other. If Zhang Yan's vitality was greatly damaged in the process, then they would have one less battle force to fight this time. Zhang Yan said calmly, "It's fine. I have already seen it. In terms of vitality, this demon has already consumed a lot of vitality. Just now, he wants to kill that incarnation. In just a short while, dozens of incarnations have appeared. This generation is competing with him for vitality. If he does not have a treasure, he will not be able to turn the situation around. Even if something goes wrong, I will inform you in time. Don't worry." Danny raised his hand and bowed. "Then I will have to trouble you." Just now, the three of them were talking in the divine will. Although it seemed like they had talked for a long time, it had only been a moment in the outside world. Now that they had come to an agreement, they retreated. Zhang Yan's eyes narrowed. He activated the secret technique and immediately sensed the location of the Scarlet Rat Demon. After a cultivator became a true young cultivator, it was like they were walking in the opposite direction from each other. However, this realm was above the past and the future. There was no such thing as distance. In an instant, one could cross tens of thousands of realms. Therefore, the distance between the mind and the divine could be as far as the sky or as close as an inch. Now that he moved, if the Scarlet Rat Demon did not retreat, then he could instantly kill his way into the origin Chi Si. At that time, it would be a pure competition of vitality. If he could stand his ground first, then Dan E and Michihito Ichito could follow closely behind. At that time, the demon would not be able to turn the tables no matter what. Duke Ji was still fighting with the incarnation. He waved his sleeve and a golden light shot out. The young man could not dodge in time, and in an instant, half of his body was shattered. However, in the next moment, it was whole again. This was because the other party had the same origin as him. No matter how many times he was killed, as long as the young fire was not extinguished and the vitality was not exhausted, he could not be killed. The only way was to drive it out. Just now, he could achieve his goal. In fact, he did have a trick up his sleeve. It was not a treasure but a secret technique taught to him by the Khanate demon. It was used to drive out the incarnation. However, it could not be used in one move. He needed to be prepared. Therefore, after fighting for a long time, he did not have the time to use it. But right at this moment, he suddenly felt a strand of vital energy lock onto him, and his heart couldn't help but shake. Instantly, he was extremely terrified and furious as he thought to himself, "What's going on? Who is it that wants to kill me? How could it be so easy to find where I am?" Normally, when a true young cultivator wanted to harm another cultivator of the same generation, they could only find the enemy's location. However, once the other person sensed it, they would naturally try to stop them. This involved a competition of vitality and divine will until one side could not bear it anymore. However, this was a long process. Killing 1,000 enemies would cost 800 of oneself. The winner might not be any better. Between true young cultivators of the same generation, unless they were outnumbered, no matter how deep their hatred was, they would not easily fight before there was a chance. However, he could sense that there was clearly only one person, so there must be a reason for it to be able to find him so quickly. However, at this moment, he had no time to care about the illogicality. He only knew that if he did not avoid it, the other party would be here in the next moment. Even if it was a close friend, he would not let it enter his origin sea because it was the foundation of his Tao. Therefore, he could only temporarily let go of the suppression on his avatar and split his attention to deal with it. Although the young man was fighting with the main body, he was still being suppressed. At this moment, he suddenly felt a lot more relaxed. He did not think about the reason and immediately went into the origin sea to desperately absorb vitality. However, he quickly discovered that the reason for this situation was not because the main body was weak, but because he was being restrained by something. When he thought of the external enemies, how could he not know the reason? After this discovery, not only was he not worried, he was wild with joy. As long as he killed the main body, he could occupy this origin sea and become a true young cultivator. He would no longer be someone's avatar. This was the purpose of his birth. Before achieving this goal, there was no need to care about anything else. Therefore, he didn't hesitate to summon his spiritual energy. Like a tidal wave, he pressed down on his real body. However, Jiangong did not dare to let it hit him and quickly used his Fa Li to block it. If he was careless and his avatar was destroyed, although he could recover in an instant, Zhang Yan might jump in at this time. However, he had to avoid the detection of the aura and deal with the attacks of the avatar. After a few rounds, he was slightly embarrassed. He was furious. He knew that the longer the avatar stayed here, the harder it would be to get rid of it. However, after thinking for a long time, he could not find a solution. In the end, if the trap laid by Zhang Yan and the other two could be broken so easily, they would not have planned for so long. On the other hand, on Zhang Yan's side, he was at ease and looked quite relaxed. His Yuan Qi was far stronger than the demon, and there was almost no burden on the avatar, so the initiative was completely in his hands. His goal was not to invade immediately, but to consume as much Yuan Qi as possible and find a way to force out the demon's hidden tricks. When he saw that the incarnation had the upper hand, he would slightly relax and allow the incarnation to counterattack. If the incarnation was suppressed, he would add a bit more power to it, always keeping the two sides in balance, allowing the other to continue fighting. After fighting with the youth for a long time, Jiangong felt that this was not the way to go. So he transmitted a message. You saw it too. If we don't deal with the enemy, we will never be able to determine the winner. When our Yuan Qi is exhausted, I won't be able to escape and you won't be able to live either. The youth said with disdain, I will not join hands with you. I would rather die with you. If you want to preserve your life, then leave everything to me. Jiangong's expression became even more gloomy. Even though the avatar was still the same person, the emotions and consciousness were different, so in reality, he no longer existed. He had painstakingly cultivated to this state, so how could he easily abandon himself? He thought for a while and said, looks like I can only use that technique. Even though it can only alleviate the situation for a while, it is better than being entangled. He opened his hand and concentrated his intent. Instantly, a jade mirror materialized in the sky and turned into a beam of light that shone down. The youth was caught off guard, or rather, he did not want to avoid it, so he was shattered again. However, this time, he did not return to his original form immediately. Jiangong was using the technique taught by the innate demon. According to the original method, after shattering the avatar, he would use his mana to suppress it and expel it out. Then he would be able to kill the demon. However, in a situation where there was an external disturbance, he could only do the first step in a hurry to catch his breath. Zhang Yan immediately sensed the change. Since the demon was able to suppress the doppelganger once, it would most likely be able to do the same again in the future. In other words, he could ignore this threat for the time being. The demon would most likely focus on escaping, which would exhaust even more origin qi. He realized that it was time to act, so he said, "Fellow Taoists, the time has come. Please follow this humble Taoist to slay this demon." Chapter 1668. Dan Yi and Michihito Ichito were already prepared to fight the Scarlet Rat Demon at any time. When they heard the call, they moved without hesitation. They did not have Zhang Yan's ability to find the real bodies of their peers at any time. Therefore, they could only follow the usual method and focus on searching for their whereabouts. Jiangong had already thought of a plan. He would first restrain the incarnation and then retreat. Even if he could not win, he could drag it out. If he could drag it out for 100 or 200 years, he would be able to escape when the Busushan Forbidden Formation was opened. Who knew, he might even be able to kill his opponent. However, just as he was deep in thought, suddenly, another 2 grand auras descended. From the looks of it, they were clearly looking for him as well. His heart was instantly filled with shock. Originally, he had already used up all his strength to deal with Zhang Yan. Who would have thought that the ones who wanted to deal with him today weren't just one person like he had thought before, but 3? At this moment, he almost cursed out loud. The Khanate fiendish demons had clearly said that the human Tao cultivators were all in hiding. None of them were in the outside world, and he was told to act without worry. However, now that they were here, he did not know a single one of them. Where did they come from? Fighting 1 against 3, he would not have the confidence to continue fighting even if his auras were at their peak. Even if it was 1,000 or 10,000 years, he could still fight them to the end. He could always make them feel that they had suffered too much and the gains did not make up for the losses, so they would retreat on their own. But it was different now. He had his incarnation here to cause trouble, and he had expended a lot of his vitality. How could he deal with 3 of his peers at the same time? This was a situation where he had no chance of winning. At this moment, he felt a deep sense of unease in his heart. It was clearly a battle of life and death, but he did not sense anything before. There were 2 possibilities. One was that the heavenly secrets were hidden by the other party. The other was that the other party had an absolute advantage, so the heavenly signs did not appear. Because no matter how he struggled, he was destined to die. At this stage, even if the heavens had determined that he was going to die, it was useless to sense anything. He naturally didn't want it to be the latter, and he only hoped that the secrets of the heavens had been concealed. Thoughts spun in his mind as he desperately thought of a way to escape. From the outside, Zhang Yan could keenly sense that after Dan Yi and Michihito Ichito attacked one after another, the demon's momentum suddenly weakened. This was because it had completely lost its fighting spirit, and it had even given birth to pessimistic thoughts, which was reflected in reality. Of course, under normal circumstances, as long as a cultivator guarded his mind, it would be impossible for outsiders to sense it so easily. It was clear that he had messed up. Seeing this flaw, he immediately focused all his attention on calculating, trying to kill his way into the other party's vital qi. This move was originally smooth, but just now, he felt a resistance when he moved, and he actually failed. Although Ji Yen panicked for a moment, he still remembered that this was a battle of life and death, so he did not deliberately do it. However, with a turn of his mind, he instinctively used the technique taught by the Xiantian demon. However, the other party also reminded him that to use this kind of divine ability, he needed a certain Tao to rely on. With his ability to forcefully use it, it was equivalent to overdrafting his future. Even if he could escape this disaster now, there would definitely be a calamity in the future, so unless it was a last resort, he should not use it. However, with life and death in front of him, why would he think so much? As for the future, If he could survive this calamity, then he could still think of a way to resolve it. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed. He realized that he was blocked by the divine ability and secret technique. But perhaps the demon himself did not notice that because of the external manifestation of the heart and the entanglement of both sides, the secret of the technique was actually exposed in front of him. He immediately remembered it, so that if he encountered it again in the future, he could try to find the flaw in it. He could even go back and repeatedly deduce it, and he might be able to restore the technique. On the battlefield, he continued to use his mana to suppress the opponent. There were 3 people on his side. Even if he did not succeed this time, there would still be a chance next time. As long as the opponent did not have any treasures on him, he would only be able to delay it for a while. In the end, he would not be able to escape. Although Ji Yan managed to escape, he knew that the danger was not over yet. Just as he was thinking of a way to salvage the situation, he saw a movement above the chi of vitality. Just now, he only cared about himself and neglected the other side, causing the young man's body to gather again. He quickly used the technique again to suppress it. At this moment, it was like he was sitting on top of 2 fires. Just now, he was trying to suppress the fire on one side and the other side was about to explode. With his ability, it was extremely difficult for him. In just a short while, he was exhausted. The replenishment of vitality was far less than the consumption. Zhang Yan could see that he could not hold on much longer, but he still had some strength left. He wanted to take a look at the technique, so he exerted more pressure on the opponent. Dan Yi and Michihito Ichito also felt the change in the demon's aura. Without any discussion, they exerted their strength together. Ji Yan felt the pressure increase, and he was very anxious. He felt that if he did not stop them, the 3 of them would barge in. Just as Zhang Yan expected, he hurriedly used the supernatural power again and managed to hold on. This time, Zhang Yan was already paying attention, and he was able to witness the supernatural power again. He secretly made some deductions, and after a while, he had an idea. This technique might be very brilliant, but the red rat demon used it crudely. It was obvious that he did not understand the subtlety of it. Now that he had a glimpse of a flaw, if the opponent used it again, he would be able to find a way to enter. Just as Ji Yan was about to deal with it, he suddenly felt a sense of danger. He turned his thoughts and blocked the spiritual power that was attacking him. He glanced to the side and saw that the incarnation had recovered. His heart was filled with hatred, and he said angrily, "If you continue to tangle with me, then it will be the day of our deaths." The young man's eyes lit up and he shouted, "Only when you die can I replace you." Not only did he not stop, but his attacks became even faster. Ji Yan was very depressed. Now he knew why many of his peers saw the incarnation as a disaster, and they were not willing to let it go. If it wasn't for the innate demon's promise, he would also be on guard, and he wouldn't be in such a situation. He fought with the incarnation for a few more rounds, and he found a flaw, and he destroyed the incarnation. However, this situation could not last long. Zhang Yan was able to sense that the aura of this demon was growing weaker and weaker, and it was growing more and more chaotic. This meant that not only was its vitality severely damaged, it was growing more and more powerless, and it was like an arrow at the end of its flight. He thought for a moment and said, "You too, I will find a suitable opportunity to rush into his vitality sea. At that time, the demon will not be able to be distracted. You too can follow me and make sure that he doesn't escape." Dan Yi knew that he had a secret technique. If there was one among the 3 of them who could rush in first, it would be Zhang Yan, so he replied, "Okay, we will do as you say." After Zhang Yan got the response, he waited with rapt attention. Soon he found another opportunity, but he was sure that the opponent would use the secret technique again. Sure enough, after a little try, he encountered another inexplicable obstruction. However, this time, he already knew the loophole, and with a thought he dodged it. Then, with a loud bang, he had already rushed into the opponent's vitality sea. Ji Yan felt his Dharma body and soul tremble. In a trance, he saw a young Taoist in a black robe with 5 lights behind him walking over. How could he not know that an outsider had intruded? He was shocked, but he did not retreat. Instead, he gritted his teeth and faced the intruder. This was his home ground, and before the intruder could stabilize his footing, he might be able to expel him. Therefore, he used all his strength to mobilize his mana. In an instant, the entire vitality sea churned, gathering an unprecedented momentum and rushing towards Zhang Yan. Although Zhang Yan's real body was here, his spirit was still connected to his vitality sea, so his combat strength was not reduced at all. When he saw this, his expression didn't change. He just stretched out his hand and pressed down. A huge palm fell down, and it actually easily suppressed the tide of mana. Ji Yan's eyes widened, as if he could not believe that his attack was so easily resolved. However, he had no way out now, so he prepared to gather his force again. However, at this moment, two huge auras rushed in. It was Michihito Ichito and Dan I. Seeing this opportunity, they jumped in one after another. Ji Yan's expression changed. He knew that he could not escape this time, so he immediately let go of the restriction on his avatar. A trace of ruthlessness flashed in his eyes, and he once again mobilized his vitality and rushed towards Zhang Yan. Even if he could not live, he would do his best to weaken the enemy. Then, when the Khanate demon broke out of the seal, he might be able to kill this person. Because he let go of the worries of life and death, his attack was even more fierce than before. Zhang Yan stood still with his sleeves behind his back. With a thought, a golden light flew up behind him. It grew from 1 to 2, and from 2 to 3. In an instant, it turned into an infinite number and spun in the air. Ji Yan felt that the golden light was everywhere, but he could not avoid it. His avatar was cut into bits of stardust. Not only that, the aftershock of the sword light also destroyed the avatar that he had just now gathered. However, the next moment, the vitality sea below shook, and his avatar reformed above. Dan I and Michihito Ichito had already stabilized their footing. Seeing this, they attacked together and destroyed the demon avatar again. However, in the blink of an eye, it reappeared again. It was the same as just now, and it did not seem to have suffered any damage. Zhang Yan was not surprised by this. He knew very well that as long as the Yang fire was not extinguished and the Yuan Qi was not exhausted, the demon could not be killed no matter what. Usually, when the battle reached this point, it was time to wear down the Yuan Qi of both sides. When the Yuan Qi was used up, the battle would be won. However, he did not need to do so. With the secret method taught by the ancestral master, he could find a way to cut off the source of the vitality after he found the true body of his peer and killed his way into the vitality sea. In this way, he could easily kill the demon. He turned the incantation in his mind, and his body suddenly shone brightly, covering the vitality sea. When Ji Yan saw it, he only felt the world spinning. He had an inexplicable feeling that at this moment, it was as if everything in the world was broken. He could not feel any vitality in his body. While he was shocked, he heard the sound of thunder, and then fell into silence. Chapter 1669. Dan I and Yi Dao only saw a flash of light on Zhang Yan's body. It was as if a speck of Yang fire shone out when one broke through to the true Yang realm, illuminating all living things. Both of them were dazed for a moment, feeling as if their auras were being suppressed. When they regained their composure, they saw a bolt of lightning strike Jiangong's body. Jiangong's avatar was instantly pulverized, but what was even more shocking was that Jiangong was no longer able to recover. They quickly tried to sense it and found that the demon's qi was gone. There was no trace left in the world. How could they not know that he was dead? For a moment, they revealed a look of disbelief. Danny looked at Zhang Yan and said, "Fellow Taoist, this is..." Halfway through his sentence, he thought of something and stopped talking. Just now, he was too shocked and lost his composure. Once he said it, he came back to his senses. Such a powerful technique must be related to the secrets of the person or even the sect. It was better for him not to ask about it. Michihito Ichito thought about it. He thought that the technique that killed the red rat demon should be a supernatural power. However, since he entered the Tao, he did not know how many years had passed and he had seen the power of many people of the same generation. However, he had never heard of such an ability before. Although true yang cultivators could turn illusions into reality and evolve all kinds of supernatural power, this kind of technique that could kill people of the same generation in an instant was beyond their limits. He could not help but have a guess, and his heart was a little excited. However, when he thought about it, he did not dare to think further. He was afraid that he would trigger some changes in the heavens. He hesitated for a moment and sighed. Not only did he not ask about it, but he also took the initiative to seal this piece of memory. At this moment, the two of them raised their heads and looked at each other. Although they knew that Zhang Yan was on their side, they both felt a chill in their hearts. However, at the same time, they were glad that this person had such a supernatural power. They were more confident in dealing with the primordial demon. At this moment, Zhang Yan stood there with a thoughtful expression. Previously, he only knew that the technique passed down by the founding ancestor could sever the origin chi of those of the same generation, but he didn't know exactly how powerful it was. After personally executing it this time, he faintly comprehended it, and he gasped in admiration towards the wonders of its operation. After all, this was the first time he had used it, so he naturally felt that there were some areas that were slightly lacking. If he encountered someone with extraordinary divine ability, he might be able to avoid it. This was a fatal flaw in a battle, but next time, he would absolutely not make such a mistake. He silently checked and found that he had consumed a lot of qi. Coupled with the previous consumption when he was chasing after the demon, he had consumed almost half of his qi. He sighed in his heart. This technique was really extravagant. It was only because he had far more achievements than the previous generations. If it was someone else, they would never be able to endure it. It was no wonder that the ancestral master had such harsh requirements for the inheritor of the Xian stone. If one's spiritual power was slightly weaker, even if they knew how to use it, they would not be able to use it. However, it was indeed very difficult to kill someone of the same generation. Today, if it wasn't for the fact that he had weakened the demon and teamed up with two other people of the same generation, if he was alone, it would take hundreds of years to determine a winner. At that time, Bu Su's Forbidden Pass would be opened. However, it was a pity that they were unable to capture the demon and refine it into a treasure. This meant that they were unable to accomplish something or overlooked something. Fortunately, he did not pay too much attention to it. The feeling he had before was because he felt that there was a possibility in the future. However, it was just a possibility and it might not come true. To achieve his goal, he needed to have all the favorable conditions. However, this was actually impossible. Firstly, he did not know where to find these conditions. Secondly, if he was alone, he might be able to give it a try. However, this time, there were three of them and each of them had different thoughts. As long as one of them did something that went against the plan and lost some luck, there would not be any results. Just as he was thinking, there was a rumble and the world in front of them collapsed. Then, everything shattered and the three of them found themselves back in the original Jia space. When a cultivator becomes a true yang cultivator, his divine intent will fall into the origin chi si to be maintained, and the origin chi si will then be able to provide endless origin chi to its master. These two aspects are one, two is one, and cannot exist alone. The disappearance of one will lead to the collapse of the other. Dan Yi turned around and said, "Fellow Taoists, this time we have cut off a chess piece of the Xiantian demon outside. When we fight with him, there will be one less threat." Zhang Yan thought for a while and said, "Just now, when we fought with this demon, he used several divine arts and Tao techniques. Can you too see through his methods?" Michihito Ichido thought for a while and said, "It seems plausible. It seems like he is not proficient in it because his cultivation of Tao techniques is not high enough. Maybe he learned it from somewhere." Danny said, "It is highly possible that the Xiantian demon taught it to him. This person also has a proper inheritance, so it is not strange for him to give him one or two defensive and life-saving techniques." When Zhang Yan heard this, he thought to himself, if that's the case, then that Xiantian demon isn't simple. It seems like I shouldn't neglect Tao techniques when raising my control over my Yuan Qi. Otherwise, I'll be easily controlled by others. I'll go back and study it further. Danny said again, There are still many incarnations of this red rat demon wandering outside. We need to clean them up to prevent them from harming the world. Duke Ji's incarnation of a young man was also killed by Zhang Yan because it was in the Vitality Sea. However, there were still some incarnations that existed in other worlds. Although without the support of the Vitality Sea, they would dissipate sooner or later. However, this might take tens or even millions of years. They were not human cultivators, so they could not be restrained. Besides, other than true yang cultivators, no lower realm cultivators could resist them. Therefore they had to be killed. Michihito Ichido said, "This is not difficult. I can sense the location of one of his incarnations." He grabbed with his hand and a jade plate appeared. He raised it slightly and said, "You just need to follow this to find it." Danny said, "It's convenient to have this item. You can give it to me. I'll deal with it when I come down." Zhang Yan thought for a while and said, "Dan-yi, you still need to find the whereabouts of those two. If you divert your attention to this matter, I'm afraid it'll be difficult for you to take care of it. Why don't you let I handle this matter?" Dan-yi said happily, "If you do it, it'll be fine." Seeing this, Michihito Ichido handed the jade plate to Zhang Yan and told him the method of controlling it. After Zhang Yan took it, he put it away. However, he would not go personally to deal with the incarnations of some demons. He was prepared to send his own incarnations. Many of his peers were afraid that the incarnations would cause trouble, but he did not have such concerns. Moreover, it was very easy for him to track their chi. None of them would escape. Danny said, "Since this red rat demon is related to the Khanate demons, there might be something left in the heavenly worlds. I'll have to trouble you to pay attention to it." Zhang Yan nodded and said, "I will." This was not difficult. Just now that the red rat demon was fighting with the incarnations, most of the heavenly worlds had collapsed. Only a small part still existed. As long as he looked for the chi, he would be able to notice anything unusual. He asked again, "Dan-yi, how long are you going to spend? When will you return?" Dan-yi thought for a while and said, "I still need to find an opportunity to refine that special chi. If I delay for too long, I'm afraid nothing will happen. I'll temporarily set the time limit at 30 years. No matter if there are any results or not, I'll rush back to meet the two of you." Zhang Yan said, "That's good too." After a few more words, Dan-yi bowed to the two of them and left first. Michihito Ichido waved his hand and took out the elephant dragon golden furnace from his heavenly worlds. He gave it to Zhang Yan and thanked him, "Thank you for lending me your treasure. I'll return it today." Zhang Yan opened his sleeves and kept it. He wanted to go back and comprehend the Taoist arts. Seeing that there was nothing to do, he bid farewell to Michihito Ichido. With a thought, he descended into the Sea of Vitality. At the same time, his consciousness returned to the Azure Sky Hall and he sat down on the jade couch. Then, he turned his gaze and looked into a heavenly world. A white-robed Taoist sensed it and looked over. He said, "The incarnation of the red rat demon is still wandering outside. Go and kill it." The white-robed Taoist got up and bowed. With a flash of spirit light, he disappeared. After giving the instructions, he took out a spell and chased after Ji Yan's figure. He looked at all the worlds that the demon had been to before. Not long after, his eyes narrowed and he reached out to grab a jade scroll and a bamboo tube. He first checked the jade scroll and found that it was not used to record, but it was similar to the two-world dial. From the remnant aura, it seemed like he had used it several times when he was alive. From the demon's behavior, the most likely person he used to communicate with was the Khanate demon. However, this person was blocked in Busu heaven and couldn't come out. It was very likely that this person was an avatar in the void primordial sea. He didn't find this strange. In order to protect Yu Huan's heavens, he had fought with this person. After thinking about it, he didn't want to find trouble with him because it was meaningless. Even if he killed him, he couldn't deal with the main body and could send him out again. However, with this item in hand, it might be useful in the future. With that thought in mind, he placed a seal on it and put it away. Then, he took the bamboo tube and injected his magic power into it. He saw many treasures he had never seen before, and there was also a magic artifact that had just been refined. He immediately realized that these were the treasures in Bu Su Tian's body. He didn't know if they were originally with him or if they were given to him by the Khanate demons. It seemed that Bu Su Tian was originally refining a treasure, but he hadn't completed it yet. Now they were all in his hands. He thought for a long time and decided to refine this magic artifact according to his own will. In the past, such a change would not be a small matter and would probably require a lot of effort. But now, with the Elephant Dragon Golden Furnace, he could save a lot of time. Thinking up to here, he shook his sleeve, and with a flash of golden light, the Elephant Dragon Golden Furnace was already standing in the hall. Chapter 1670. Zhang Yan channeled his technique for a moment and the golden elephant dragon cauldron trembled slightly, emitting bursts of buzzing sounds. Then, wisps of dense smoke came out from the 8 openings of the cauldron. It looked like washed jade, and when it reached the sky, it gathered into the shape of a canopy. He knew that the fire was now enough, and he could more or less refine it. He took the treasure embryo into his hand. It was a winged flying squirrel. At this moment, its eyes were closed, and its 4 limbs were curled up like a ball, as if it was sleeping soundly. Holding it in his hand, it was only the size of a fist, and it looked very delicate. Its belly was even moving up and down, as if it was breathing, as if it was still alive. In reality, there was indeed a bit of spirituality within it, and it could not be considered as a completely dead object. He guessed that this might have been refined from the body that the demon had shed, and it must have been refined by the demon for a long time. From this, it could be considered as a top-notch treasure. According to common sense, apart from this monster, no one else could lay their hands on this kind of thing. This was because the precious embryo and it had long become one. Even if it was already dead, as long as its aura didn't match, it wouldn't be able to use it. However, the golden incense dragon cauldron was an exception. This treasure could cleanse the inside and outside of the body and recreate the spirit, making all of this possible. He threw the treasure embryo into the cauldron, and at this moment he faintly heard a shrill scream. It was because the spirituality within was being burned by the cauldron, but with a little more training, it could be erased and recreated. After refining here for about a few months, he looked through the cauldron again, but there was no trace of the flying squirrel, and at this moment, there was only a white gas circulating in the cauldron. He understood that this should have been effective. The biggest advantage of using the golden incense dragon cauldron was that if there was originally a treasure embryo or a magic tool already made, then it would not take long for it to be completed. At most, it would be refined once, and there was no need to start all over again. Another half a year passed, and as the cauldron fire grew stronger, the white gas condensed into one and became more and more spiritual, as if it was about to break out of the cauldron. Zhang Yan couldn't help but nod his head. This precious embryo's origins were extraordinary, and with just a bit of refinement, it was already born with strange abilities. However, this was all, and it was far from the end. According to the current situation, it would not be of much use in a battle against a true young cultivator. As such, he needed to refine it further and focus his consciousness on it to see any changes. He closed his eyes and pondered for a moment. Then he opened his eyes. Previously, he had obtained quite a number of treasure sacrificing and crafting methods in the ancestral master's abode. This time, it was just the right time to use them. Thus, he stretched out his hand and took all the treasures left behind by the monster. Previously, he had seen many records left behind by his ancestors from Fu Qingming, Emote Song and the others, so he recognized these things and also knew their uses. At this moment, after a slight selection, he took out a pair of model dragon horns. This was obtained from the body of a true dragon. It should have been cut off when it was still alive. Just by looking at the forked wrinkles on the horns, it was obvious that this was an old dragon. Unfortunately, even if it was powerful in front of a true young cultivator, it was no different from an ordinary insect. He then took out dozens of treasures that were not inferior to the dragon horns before stopping. This took up about a third of all the treasures. As for the rest, he planned to hand them over to Michihito Ichito and Dan E to deal with. This time, The three of them worked together to slay the monster, so he couldn't take it alone. However, just the things in his hands were more than enough to refine treasures. At this moment, his expression was solemn as he placed the treasures into the furnace one by one. Then, he immersed his consciousness into it. At the same time, the vitality in his body was rapidly depleting. However, with the replenishment of the Vitality Sea, it was almost instantaneous. Although a true yang cultivator could turn illusory into reality, because of the limitations of the treasured embryo and treasured materials, it was impossible to change what was refined in the end. All he could do was to try his best to reach the upper limit of what it could carry. With this kind of concentration, after refining for 2 years, he saw the smoke and clouds above the furnace condense into a solid form. In the end, it slowly fell down and merged with the treasures in the furnace. Zhang Yan's brows couldn't help but raise when he saw this. This was a rare phenomenon of energy and spirit fusing together. Based on the consciousness of the elephant dragon, even though it wasn't extremely rare, it could be considered to be rare. Usually, it was something that could only be seen after over 100 refinements. At this time, the movement in the furnace did not stop, and the crisp tinkling sound was like the playing of celestial music. After waiting for about a few hours, the sound gradually subsided, but then there was the sound of knocking on the wall. The sound was light and soft, as if a creature was about to be born into the world and wanted to break out of its shell. He smiled slightly. With a wave of his sleeve, he opened the lid of the furnace. Suddenly, the furnace flashed with a green light and flew into his hand. He lifted it up and looked at it, only to see a twin-winged serpent circling around his fingertip. Its entire body seemed as if it was carved from crystal jade, and it was glossy and slightly green in color. Its body was long and slender, and there was a pair of slightly protruding short horns on its head. There was a pair of small wings on its back, and it seemed to be slightly exquisite. However, its eyes flickered with a bright light, and it actually contained a dignified aura. At this moment, when it saw Chen Shi looking over, it retracted its wings and lowered its head, and it was in a respectful and submissive state. Looking closely, he found that the meridians, bones, and even the blood, qi, and tendons in its body were all intact, almost like a real living creature. This was because he not only used the secret method passed down by the ancestor, but also tried to add his own understanding of the living refinement technique. Now, this was not only a magic tool, but also a master and servant. He tried to pour in yuan qi, and the winged serpent immediately sensed his intention. It immediately curled into a ring, its body faintly glowing, looking like a beautiful green jade. Everyone had a different understanding of the use of magic tools. He believed that with a treasure in hand, he needed to be able to display his advantages as much as possible and avoid his shortcomings. Compared to other people of the same generation, his yuan qi was undoubtedly the most abundant, but there were times when he might not be able to display it completely. For example, when he was fighting with the red rat demon, he used a spell to find its true body, but it could find a way to avoid it, unable to immediately jump into the sea of yuan qi. The main reason for this was that even though his yuan qi was superior to his opponent, when he was searching, he could not display it completely. Even if he reached the second stage of controlling yuan qi, he might not be able to do this. This was because the opponent's qi was unstable. This was like if one person was escaping in front, and the other person was chasing from behind. Only when the opponent's yuan qi was exhausted and gradually weakened, could the opponent be caught. Not only that, the defending side naturally had an advantage, and only needed to expend a little yuan qi to avoid it. In this battle, if Dan Yi and Michihito Ichido did not use their strength at the same time, even if he could win in the end, he was afraid that it would be at least a few hundred years later. If the demon's willpower was a little stronger, it was possible that the battle would last for thousands of years. He thought that this was one of his shortcomings. Even if he had a secret method in hand, he was afraid that it would be difficult for him to display its true power. Therefore, he targeted this point and tried to sacrifice and refine this treasure. Now it seemed that the result was rather gratifying. The ability of this treasure, when he used any kind of supernatural power or secret method, could transfer out the largest amount of yuan qi that could be withstood. With this help, in the future when he calculated the true location of the opponent, if the opponent wanted to avoid it, they would have to transfer at least enough magical power to resist his invasion. In other words, in this instant, he could force the opponent to compete with him in yuan qi. If the opponent was no match for him, then he could immediately rush in and cut off the source of yuan qi. In an instant, he could decide the outcome of the battle. Of course, there must be a flaw here. First of all, this treasure could not repeatedly withstand yuan qi, so he could only use it once in a short period of time. It might not be effective the second time, but it was enough. Also, if the opponent's control of yuan qi had reached an extremely fine level and the magical power gathered was just enough to resist him, then it would be useless. But after all, this was a method, and if used at the right time, it might be able to reverse the situation. Zhang Yan looked down at the flood serpent and pondered for a moment. In his mind, he gave it the treasure name Celestial Snake Bracelet. With this name, the aura of the treasure rose slightly. With a flick of his sleeve, he put it away. There was still one more thing to do. This time, he was able to break the Red Rat Demon's evasion technique in a short period of time because his secret technique was higher than his opponent's. But he believed that if it was a Khanate demon that used the same technique, it would not be so easily broken. Therefore, after the battle, he wanted to study Dao techniques. But to do this, it was not something that could be achieved by just sitting in seclusion. Usually he needed to spar with his peers. If he could not do it, then he could only use the method of splitting heaven and earth and create a magnificent world. Then he would naturally be able to understand some of the mysteries of the Great Way. At this moment, he could open up a world with a thought. But this was just a random creation, and it would not consume much energy. But to understand the mysteries of heaven and earth, he had to put all his attention into it. However, he needed to make some preparations before doing so. Thinking to there, he first intentionally visualized in his mind, but not long after he sensed something in his heart. His eyes flashed, and he retreated from meditation and looked towards a certain part of the heaven realm. He saw his avatar standing in the space in front of Bu Su Tian, and there were a few malicious auras confronting it. He thought about it and understood the whole story. After this avatar received his order, it chased the demon avatar everywhere. However, one of them escaped to Bu Su Tian, but there was a restriction formation there. It was easy to come out, but difficult to enter. In the end, his avatar caught up and killed it. But at the same time, this avatar massacred the demon tribes that gathered there again. This action was noticed by the Khanate demons in Bu Su Tian, and they seemed to want to kill this avatar. However, at this moment, when he sent his consciousness over, they seemed to know that they would not be able to gain any advantage, so they quickly retreated. He thought about it for a while, then sent a message to the avatar to leave. He knew that this matter was not over. These demons had been ruined by him time and time again, so they would not suffer for nothing. Now that they could not fight him head-on, they might play tricks behind his back. Sure enough, just as he had this thought, he felt some movement in the Yuhuan heavens. Chapter 1671. Zhang Yan had promised to protect Fu Qingming when he was reincarnated, so he had been paying attention to the Yuhuan heavens. He had not relaxed in the slightest. At this moment, if there was any movement, he would immediately notice it. There were about 10 void creatures heading towards the Qinghua heaven. They were all ferocious and far stronger than the ones he had seen before. If there was no accident, their bodies should have been reconstructed by the Khanate demons. This should be the Khanate demons' counterattack. His eyes flashed. Did they think he wouldn't see such a brazen act? Or were there other arrangements? Thinking of this, he couldn't help but be moved. This matter couldn't be so simple. He didn't immediately deal with the void creatures. Instead, he focused his mind and looked around the various realms. After looking back and forth a few times, his gaze finally stopped at the Yunshu realm. In a state city in the lower realms, a certain wealthy family gave birth to a baby girl. Her appearance was obedient and cute, her eyes were clear, and she was extremely beautiful. Moreover, there was a faint fragrance around her body, causing the entire family to be extremely fond of her, and they were discussing whether to send her to the celestial sect to cultivate in a few years. Zhang Yan's eyes narrowed. He noticed something strange about the baby girl. If there was no accident, she had been possessed by the evil spirit, or perhaps she had been reincarnated. This wasn't surprising. The evil spirit had always had this ability. It was just that ever since the Yunshu realm had been pacified and officially became a lower realm of the mountain and sea realm, it hadn't made any moves. This was because it would notice any foreign chi that came. On the other hand, it seemed that it knew that the person behind it couldn't be provoked anymore. But he didn't expect that this time, this person would come here again. Furthermore, the timing was so coincidental that it was very likely that it was the intention of the Khanate demons. If he hadn't been vigilant enough, it might have succeeded. This time, the evil spirit's method was very clever. The baby girl didn't seem to have any problems at the moment. Even after she grew up, she would only think of herself as a normal person. This was because the person behind it had cut off their connection to him in order to hide from his senses. Only when one's cultivation reached a certain level, or when they came into contact with the real evil spirit, would they be able to awaken just now. Given this woman's talent, if nothing unexpected happened, she would become one of the higher-ups of a sect. Perhaps she would even be accepted by the mountain and sea realm. If she wasn't careful, the location of the mountain and sea realm would be exposed. If the Khanate demons found out, it wouldn't be a good thing. Zhang Yan thought for a moment, but didn't make a move. Since this was the case, he might as well exchange a few blows with it. This wasn't because he was being careless, but it was because this person had surely utilized some sort of divine ability or secret technique to be able to hide from his senses. So long as he saw it, it wouldn't be difficult for him to pry into its profundities, and so long as he took precautions in advance, then it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. After a moment of consideration, he pointed his finger downwards and placed a talisman on the baby girl's body. In the future, when she awakened, she might not necessarily side with the evil spirits. In order to avoid his senses, her previous self had cut off her connection to her past. In the future, she would rely on her current life's memories. In other words, this woman would live on as a human cultivator. When she awakened, it would be up to her to decide what she wanted to do. If she still saw herself as a human, then everything would be the same, and there would be no need to worry about the past. If she really did side with the evil spirits, and raised her sword against her fellow sect members, then the talisman would act out. The family noticed that there was a birthmark on the baby girl's arm. It looked ethereal and otherworldly, like a cloud-patterned rui. Everyone who saw it couldn't help but click their tongues in wonder. They were certain that this was immortal destiny. Perhaps her previous self had been an immortal, which made them even more determined to send their daughter to the Immortal Crossing sect. Zhang Yan looked at it for a while, then retracted his consciousness and looked back at the myriad heavens of Yuhuan. This was Fu Qingming's last hiding place, and there were restrictions here as well. Although the void creature's attacks were fierce, they couldn't break through the restrictions in a short period of time. However, this was still the work of the Khanate demons. The cultivators of this world might be able to hold on for now, but they wouldn't be able to hold on for much longer. He sneered and looked over with his consciousness. After a while, the void creature's body shook. They no longer attacked the boundary gate of heaven and earth. Instead, they turned around and went to Bushutian to devour the monsters there. At this moment, he changed his consciousness and turned them to his side. In the future, they would only be interested in the demons. This time, he had taken the initiative to throw out a challenge. If those demons were willing to accept it, then they could use this opportunity to learn from each other. If this junior wanted to continue, then he would naturally accompany him to the end. Through this battle, he could learn more about this junior. However, when those void spirits entered the world created by Patriarch Huantong, their bodies cracked and they died one by one. This situation happened to be displayed in front of the remaining monster clans, which made them extremely excited. Zhang Yan laughed. It seemed that it wasn't that these Khanate demons didn't want to continue fighting with him. They didn't forget to use this matter to boost the morale of the demons. In this way, It would seem that their main plan was to rely on the female infant, and they weren't really trying to fight him. They were merely trying to distract him and conceal their true intentions. However, they didn't know that he'd already seen through them. Just as he was about to withdraw his gaze, he glanced at the remaining demon tribes and a question arose in his heart. These demons were so persistent in building the demon tribe. Even though it had been destroyed several times, they still tried to rebuild it. It could be said that they were persevering. But their intention was not as simple as it seemed on the surface. After thinking for a while, he shook his head. There were too few clues. Bu Su Tian was a blur to him, and it was difficult for him to make a correct judgment. Under these circumstances, he could only focus on his own matters. There wasn't much time left until the restriction was broken. Before the battle, he had to at least be able to control his Yuan Qi as he pleased. As long as he had enough strength, he would be able to deal with all the obstacles. However, he had to control his Yuan Qi at the same time. He didn't have much time to think about other things. He had found out what the demons used today, but he couldn't be sure next time. Therefore, before this, he needed to make some arrangements. The simplest way was to let his incarnation monitor the world. As long as the demons couldn't come out, he would be safe. After thinking about it, he sent this thought to his incarnation. Then he no longer cared about the outside world. He sat down and turned his consciousness. In an instant, there was chaos both inside and outside. He was going to visualize the opening of the sky and experience the mysteries of the universe to verify himself. Although he had opened up quite a few worlds in the past and could be considered to be familiar with the process, it was different this time. He did not rely on his own will, but was prepared to follow the natural fortune. In other words, he was only pushing things from behind, and not actively interfering. With a turn of his thoughts, the chaotic qi began to move. After doing this, he didn't care about it anymore. The chaos was originally quiet and had no movement. It had no past, no future, no name, no shape, and was difficult to describe. Now that it was stirred, there was a sudden change. Yin and Yang were separated. Clear qi rose and turbid qi fell. With all of this, there was the beginning and end. After a long period of change, there was the opening of the universe and the separation of heaven and earth. In fact, it was best to deduce it in the real world. That way, he could better understand the changes. However, he didn't have the time to wait. Therefore, he only manifested it in his consciousness and could deduce it to the future. If he did this in the real world, he didn't know how much his vitality would be damaged. However, this was after all the true changes of heaven and earth. There were some places that weren't perfect. Fortunately, he had a method that could make up for it in the future. Billions of years passed in the blink of an eye. Due to the birth of the sun, moon, and stars, the world turned from dark and gloomy to bright. There were mountains on the surface, light, fire, lightning, rain, dew, and feng shui. However, at this time, the entire world was still in turmoil. This was because of the separation of yin and yang. After an unknown number of years, everything slowly calmed down. Living beings gradually multiplied in the vast land and even the mountains in the sky. They were all formed by the clear and turbid qi. Under the nourishment of vitality, their bodies were incomparably huge. They were born with the ability to move mountains and drain seas. Zhang Yan watched all of this with cold eyes. Although these living beings were wily and had extremely long lifespans, they were only controlled by their own instincts. They were like a rough stone that hadn't been polished. If there was no transformation, then they could only stop here. Because this was the birth of heaven and earth, there were still floods, thunder, and fire wreaking havoc everywhere. After a long period of wear and tear, some living beings died and returned to heaven and earth. Some of them had shallow intelligence in resisting the wind, fire, and lightning. They began to know how to seek benefits and avoid harm. However, without guidance, they were still muddle-headed. The sun rose and the moon set. The cycle continued. Time passed again. Earth, fire, wind, and water finally settled. It was no longer as violent as before. All kinds of strange living beings also appeared. The number of living beings that were born was less than 1,000, and the number was still decreasing. This was because even though they had successfully survived the initial tribulation, they had become even more powerful because of it. However, because they did not know the method of cultivation, the origin energy they could inhale and exhale was completely unable to sustain their bodies. If it was said that what they had experienced at the beginning was the tribulation of the world, then this was their own tribulation. If they did not seek change, then they would be completely annihilated. When Zhang Yan saw this, he thought for a moment. He expended a portion of his vital qi and shone one of the dying creatures into the real world. After observing it for a moment, he sent a trace of vital qi over and threw it into one of the lower worlds. He was prepared to see if there was any difference between the internal and external changes. After he finished doing this, he turned around to take a closer look. However, right at this moment, an unexpected event occurred. Suddenly, flames surged from the ground, and stars fell from the sky. Such a calamity of fortune far surpassed any of the previous calamities. All the living beings that had evolved over the course of tens of thousands of years had actually perished at this moment, and they no longer existed. Chapter 1672. Zhang Yan also knew that once the world was formed, there would be many disasters. Since the birth of the living creatures, it was not always smooth sailing. There would be a few ups and downs. However, this tribulation had come so suddenly, and there'd actually been no signs beforehand. He observed for a while and realized that it was not because he took away the living creature. It was because after the evolution of the yin and yang qi, although it was clear and turbid, it was from broad to narrow, from big to small. Hence, the process was still ongoing and had not really ended. Just now, it was actually the last change of the clear and turbid air after the opening of the sky. Under the rotation of the Earth's opportunity, a few heavenly stars nearby were pulled over and fell to the ground. That was why such a scene happened. As long as one could survive it, he would welcome a new life. Unfortunately, this was a small matter to the world, but to the living creatures, it was a disaster. Since that was the case, he did not pursue the matter further and continued to read. Because the disaster had passed, the world was still considered stable. Not long after, living creatures were born on the ground. However, the good times did not last long, and they were destroyed in the next catastrophe. In the next billions of years, the living creatures in the world experienced about 7 major disasters, and every time, they were all destroyed. He found out the reason, and it was actually because of the spiritual opportunity of heaven and earth. Ever since the spiritual opportunity flourished, it had been rising. It would gradually hide into the living creatures in the world, and it would benefit the living creatures in a short period of time. However, if there was no external force to reduce it, it would explode when it reached a certain limit. In other words, if the living creatures could find a cultivation method to use the spiritual opportunity and then absorb and exhale, they could delay the process. However, there must be a limit, and they could not blindly absorb it. Otherwise, once the spiritual opportunity declined, they would end up like the 9 continents. After an unknown number of years, the living creatures in the world experienced dozens of reincarnations, and finally, they were no longer destroyed. Instead, they could survive for a long time. However, this was not because the living creatures in this world were unique, but because the spiritual opportunity of heaven and earth was almost exhausted, and it began to go downhill. As these living creatures stayed in the world for a long time, there were finally people who cultivated Taoism. Their cultivation method was also unique, and there were some good points. However, their shortcomings were also obvious. They did not have enough spiritual opportunity, and it was difficult for them to reach the great path. After that, there was nothing else worth looking at. Only after the world had transformed into nirvana did he withdraw his gaze. However, after observing for a while, he faintly felt that he had gained something. True yang cultivators were able to materialize illusions into reality, but that was because their bodies were already conforming to heaven and earth, and everything they did was in accordance with the wondrous Tao of nature. However, it was not necessarily the case that they were truly proficient in the Tao of nature. On his path of cultivation, The things that he understood when he was a junior would be overturned when he reached the upper realm. This was because as his cultivation rose, his horizons were broadened, and his understanding of the world became more thorough. However, there were still cultivators in the upper realm above the true young. That was why he thought that it was correct. However, if he were to look at the infinite void or the upper realm, that might not be the case. This was imperfection, uncertainty, opportunity, and fate. It was precisely because of this that obstacles appeared on the path of a cultivator, but it was also because of this that a cultivator could continue forward. The projection of the divine will here was his own understanding. After he had deduced it to the extreme, he would then compare it with the world in the real world. Perhaps he could use this to understand the things that he had overlooked and make up for what he had lost. However, just now, this was not enough to advance his understanding of Tao. Therefore, after some consideration, he removed this world and decided to start over again. Fortunately, all of this was carried out in the divine will, so it did not consume much qi. If it was carried out directly in the real world for billions of years, the loss would be great, and it would also waste time. This time, he decided to use a different method. Before this, he had been watching as a bystander and did not participate personally. If after the rise of heaven and earth, those living beings with great power would receive guidance from the Taoist method and immediately know the method of cultivation, to what extent would the heaven and earth evolve to? Then he changed his mind and opened up another world. This change was similar to the last time, but the details were different. Similarly, the living beings born with supernatural powers were born in the world. However, at the beginning, they were all ignorant and unclear, so he did not take any action. After going through the trial of creation, those living beings who could survive vaguely grasped some tricks. Just like what he saw before, if he did not intervene, then it would only be a repeat of the previous scene. He knew that the time had come, so with a thought, a black-robed Taoist landed on the highest and majestic peak. There were very few living beings here, only a white tree grew. The Taoist stretched out his hand and snapped a branch. Then he took out a stone and turned it into an incense burner. After lighting it, he sat down and began to carve on the ground. It was as if he was writing with a brush, but also as if he was describing all things in nature. Following his actions, there was a subtle sound of xian qi, as if someone was whispering into one's ear. However, one could not help but continue listening. The violent spiritual vigor around the mountain seemed to have calmed down. About 100 years later, there was a sudden flash of spiritual light on the white tree. Then, it turned into a young man who bowed to the black-robed Taoist respectfully and stood at the side. Another few hundred years passed, and the sky darkened. It was a living being with a wingspan of tens of thousands of feet. However, it seemed to be attracted by the smoke from the incense burner and lingered in the sky. The longer it stayed there, the smaller its body became, and the more intelligent its eyes became. Finally, it transformed into a woman in red and stood at the side respectfully. In the years that followed, living beings continued to gather here. However, there was a limit to the amount of space on the mountain, so they could only settle for the next best thing. They quickly realized that even if they reached the bottom, they could still gain enlightenment. They seemed to be pulled by an inexplicable wei, and they unconsciously breathed in and out to guide the spiritual vigor. As the black-robed Taoist wrote, tens of thousands of years passed. The strokes were clearly just inches away, but at every moment, many different mysteries could be seen. One day, he stopped what he was doing and looked down. It was the first time in 10,000 years that he shifted his gaze elsewhere. He saw that the entire mountain was occupied by living beings. Even on the ground far away, there were densely packed figures. And standing at the very front, most of them had transformed into human form. There were about 100 of them. The young man that the white tree had transformed into had been here for the longest time, so he had the deepest understanding of the mysteries of guidance. Naturally, he understood many principles. He came up and bowed, saying respectfully, "Disciple greets exalted master." The red-robed woman that the sky bird had transformed into also came up and bowed. The black-robed Taoist did not say anything. He only handed over the branch in his hand. The young man was stunned, but he took it. Then he flicked his sleeves and left on the clouds. Seeing that he had left, the living beings only looked at him blankly. Some even prostrated on the ground to send him off. However, the red-robed woman was unwilling to give up. She transformed into her original form and hurriedly chased after him. However, the higher she went, the stronger the resistance became. Eventually, she could only land with a hint of unwillingness. After she landed, she realized that most of the living beings on the mountain had disappeared. Only the young man was still there. Seeing her, he went up and said, "Junior sister, you're back?" The red-robed woman looked disappointed. Then, she came to her senses and asked in confusion, "Junior sister?" The young man smiled and said, "You and I both listen to Exalted Master's teachings, so we're from the same sect. My name is Baidu. May I ask for Junior sister's name?" The red-robed woman was in a trance. An inexplicable feeling shone in the depths of her heart. She blurted out, "My name is Chi Yao." Baidu said, "So it's Junior sister Chi Yao. Did you manage to catch up with Exalted Master?" Chi Yao shook her head. Baidu smiled and said, "Although Exalted Master doesn't preach Tao anymore, the fate of Master and disciple has not ended. When you and I have cultivated enough, we will meet again." When Chi Yao heard this, she became excited and said, "Really?" Baidu waved the branch in his hand and said, "Actually, Exalted Master had already told me about this when he was carving." Chi Yao said calmly, "I'm not as good as senior brother." She glanced at the branch that was as white as jade. She could feel an inexplicable wailing on it. It made people feel close to it, but it also made her feel fearful. She couldn't help but ask enviously, "Did Exalted Master give you this?" Baidu smiled and said, "Exalted Master also left something for you." Chi Yao felt something in her heart. She turned her head and saw an incense burner placed there. Just by looking at it, she knew it belonged to her. Thus, she happily went forward and held it up. She said, "Thank you, senior brother." Baidu smiled and said, "This should have belonged to you, junior sister." He pondered for a moment and said, "Junior sister, where are you going?" Chi Yao said, "I'm looking for an uninhabited place to cultivate. There are many things that I don't understand from Exalted Master. What advice does senior brother have for me?" Baidu sighed and said, "Junior sister, I'm afraid you won't be able to relax. You and I still have a lot of things to do." Chi Yao was confused and said, "What?" Baidu said seriously, "Back then, there were about 100 people who listened to Exalted Master's teachings and obtained this body. It breathed spiritual vigor and operated supernatural powers. However, the power of its attack was also stronger than before. If it wasn't carefully maintained, I'm afraid this place would have been destroyed." He waved the branch in his hand and pointed at the incense burner. "Since you and I have taken this thing, we should take responsibility for it." Zhang Yan saw all of this. What his incarnation passed down was the most basic Tao technique. It was just that the heaven and earth had just been born and the spiritual vigor was abundant. This generation was born with supernatural powers. Therefore, with just a few pointers, they were enlightened. At the same time, he also found a method that could be used against the enemy. As long as he left this world in his spirit and set up many forbidden formations passed down by the patriarch, when he fought with the enemy, he could perceive it in an instant and trap himself or his opponent in it. In an ordinary world, a true young cultivator could rise and fall with a thought. However, this place was different. As he poured in many thoughts and familiarized himself with every change, it was connected to his chi dynamic. If he added the forbidden formations passed down by the patriarch, once it entered the present world, it would not be so easy to destroy it. Doing this was like working hard in advance and building a cage. However, there was a price to pay. The vitality that was used here was not small and he had to find a way to maintain it. This was like carrying a heavy burden at all times. But doing this was worth it. Even though his vital chi was thick, he couldn't use all of it right now, and that would be equivalent to wasting a portion of it. But now, he could make use of it. Moreover, he could feel that this was also a method of cultivation. As his Tao became more profound, this method would become easier and easier. Chapter 1673. Zhang Yan sat in meditation and cultivated. In the blink of an eye, more than 20 years had passed. With the help of the broken jade, he became more and more proficient in controlling his origin qi. Now, even without the void-concealing jade membrane to transfer his magic power, he could still use his origin qi to travel through the 10,000 realms. He didn't need to worry about the powerful qi affecting the living beings in the world. On the other hand, the heavens and the earth within his divine decree grew even more stable. Just as he'd thought before, even though he carried a burden, maintaining a world at all times had similarly deepened his comprehension of the Tao art. At this moment, it wasn't as heavy as it was at the beginning. However, because he needed to observe the mysteries of the universe, other than preaching the Tao, he didn't interfere much with the operation of the world. He relied purely on the living beings in the heaven realm to protect it. At this time, he also found something wrong. If it was in the modern world, as long as there was spiritual opportunity, it would most likely attract the creatures of the void. If it was the mountain and sea realm, the land of the 9 continents, or the high sky realm, it was a different story. This was because the heaven realm was either left behind by powerful beings or protected by magic treasures left behind by ancestors. However, this was only because the creatures of the void were blocked outside. It didn't mean they didn't exist. If the heaven realm he created was in the modern world, it would easily attract them. Fortunately, it was not too late to make up for it. He created many creatures of the void and allowed them to enter the world. Those in the heaven realm were born with great spells. Many of their abilities were honed by fighting against the world's calamities. Later, they were enlightened by Tao, so they were all extremely powerful. When they saw enemies coming, they naturally fought back. However, the creatures of the void were not easy to deal with. Every time they came, they would steal a large amount of spiritual opportunity. Even if they were defeated and killed, the spiritual opportunity would not be returned. Bai Dou and the others also sensed the danger. Spiritual opportunity was what they relied on to cultivate. Without it, they could not improve themselves. If these things came a few more times, they wouldn't be able to withstand it. The key was that they couldn't fight back and could only passively resist. Realizing this, after a discussion, everyone went to the mountain peak where the sermon was held. They burned incense and prayed, praying for Zhang Yan to bestow a way to save them. At this time, Zhang Yan happened to be at a critical juncture in the performance of divine will, and this was exactly what he wanted. Thus, his incarnation descended to the lower realm and preached again. This time, not only did he guide everyone in their cultivation, he also imparted the restrictive formation method to resist the invasion of the outer world, so that everyone could build it themselves. Of course, with the abilities of these natives, it was already their limit to build a restriction that could stop void beings. It was impossible for them to reflect the restriction and trap true young cultivators. As such, these places had to be arranged by the natives themselves. However, through this matter, it was equivalent to telling them that outer space wasn't a safe place, and besides the vast universe, there were all sorts of dangers as well. It could be considered as making up for this missing link. After he finished arranging all of this, he came down to set up the formation. However, as his cultivation improved, he unexpectedly discovered even more profundities, and a bold idea was born in his mind. Previously, he only thought that he could reflect this part of the world into the real world when he fought with his enemies, and thus have the effect of trapping his peers. However, he also knew that this wouldn't be effective for long, and his opponents would quickly break out. However, he believed that in a battle, even if it was only for a short moment, it would be extremely useful. However, there was a method here that could be used to form the formation of the heavens. It was to use the heavens and earth as a restriction, and the layers were interlocked like a ring, revolving around each other to create a cage. If he could open up several heavens in his divine will and arrange them according to this, then the effect would not be just a little bit when used in battle. Right now, he only had 1 heavens in his divine will, but if he forced it, he could also create 3 or 4. The key was that as his understanding of Tao deepened, it became easier for him to control his yuan qi. In fact, this number could continue to increase, and if he worked hard in this direction, it might not be impossible. However, there wasn't much time left until Bu Shutian's restriction was lifted. If he couldn't complete it before then, it might be a waste of effort. After thinking about it deeply, he finally made up his mind to do it. The Khanate demons had treasures, but they didn't have many methods to defeat the enemy. If they didn't find a way to help themselves, how could they hope to win this battle? No matter how difficult it was, how could it be compared to the danger of life and death, and the danger of the human Tao? Although he had made up his mind, he wouldn't act recklessly. Before he did it, he first made a deduction and had a plan in mind before proceeding. After a long time, he opened up another heavens and earth in his divine will and carefully guarded it. If anything went wrong, he would immediately withdraw and find the problem before continuing. Time continued to pass while he was in seclusion. Suddenly, one day, he felt his heart shake, as if he had broken free from some shackles, and he came out from his meditation. He tried to examine it and found that in the past, it was difficult for him to circulate his yuan qi freely. Not only was it sluggish, but if he used a bit of force, it would stir up the heaven's spiritual qi. He could release it, but he couldn't retract it. Now, although it couldn't be said that he had already reached the stage where he could do as he pleased, it was incomparably smooth. It was as if he was a chess piece on the chessboard, and he could move it wherever he wanted. Instantly, he knew that he had already stepped into the second stage. At this stage, true yang cultivators wouldn't have any improvement in their yuan qi, but there were benefits to subduing their own yuan qi. Originally, it was like wearing thick clothes while walking, but when it was used, there would always be some deviation from what they wanted. Now that they had gotten rid of the disease, they could be said to be unrestrained and their will was free. As for how long it would take to reach this stage, it was actually not fixed. Some were willing to slowly grind it out, while others could do it without a long time. From the records in the Jade Slip, he wasn't the one who took the shortest time. There was a senior who immediately subdued his yuan qi on the day he achieved true yang. This caused many people of the same generation to praise him, which was why it was recorded in the book. However, because of the depth of everyone's yuan qi, as well as the different cultivation methods, the things that they could do were different. Zhang Yan's yuan qi was so strong that on the day he achieved true yang, it had reached an unprecedented level. Even if it was that person, they wouldn't be able to subdue him immediately. Moreover, at that time, that person had many people of the same generation to learn from. He was alone and had to rely on himself to explore, so he couldn't compare so simply. As long as they hadn't reached the rumored third stage, then there wasn't much difference between true yang cultivators. As long as their yuan qi wasn't too far apart, then when they fought, it would depend more on their own methods. He stood up from the ocean of yuan qi. In an instant, a huge wave of qi swept across the sky, but it didn't disturb any living beings. At this moment, he had an epiphany. With such an achievement, it was time for the tribe to be famous. He looked up, and all kinds of images of the past flashed before his eyes. He thought to himself, my cultivation method came from the 5 directions 5 elements Taishan true light that senior brother Zhou taught me. It is said that this time it came from the ancient Taishan sect. Although I have repeatedly deduced it, it is no longer the original. If we talk about the source, then it must have something to do with it, so it should be named Xian. I became a disciple of the Qinsong sect and learned all kinds of magical powers. After that, I enjoyed the opportunity left behind by the ancestral master and refined the Zhou Huanyuan jade. Just now, I have broken through the heavenly gate and achieved the true yang. As such, I should name my name Yun. I will use the name Xian Yuan when I rule the tribe. It is the Xian Yuan tribe. The name of this tribe was both natural and self-made. Because what he did was in accordance with nature and the heaven and earth, there was no difference between the two. He calculated a little. From the day he started his seclusion until now, exactly 30 years had passed. There were only a few days left before he would meet up with Dan Yi. So as his thoughts turned, he had already fallen into darkness. However, after a while, as the light bloomed, the world became clear. Michihito Ichido walked out from the light and bowed, "Greetings, fellow Zhang." Zhang Yan also bowed. Michihito Ichido looked at him and was slightly surprised. Although it was only Zhang Yan's clone, under the influence of the qi, he could feel that it was different from before. If it was said that before it was sharp and strong, then at this moment, it was like one, peaceful and quiet. He had entered the sect long ago and naturally knew what it meant. He said, "It seems that you have gained something again, fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "This is mine to begin with. How did I gain it?" Michihito Ichido also smiled. He pointed at him and then at himself and said, "Fellow Taoist, if you think that you have it, then you have it. If you think that you can't, then you don't have it. It's purely up to you and me." Dan Yi had yet to arrive. The two of them exchanged a few pleasantries before Michihito Ichido invited him to the inner realm. This time, they were not on the road to the state city. Instead, they arrived at a temple. There were two huge pine trees in front of the door. After walking in, they saw a Dao servant sweeping the courtyard. When he saw the two of them, he stopped and bowed with a Dao salute before moving to the side. Michihito Ichido nodded at him and continued walking in. Zhang Yan took a look and felt an aura that was different from the things in this world. He said, "The person who lives here seems to have some background?" This person was not a true young person. He could have seen the shadow of the past and understood the details. However, this was Michihito Ichido's territory. Out of respect for the owner, he did not do that. Michihito Ichido said, "The people here were not created by me. They relied on me to avoid the Khanate demons." Zhang Yan's eyes moved slightly. He said, "Bu Su came from heaven?" Although ancestral Master Huantong had sealed the door, that was only because the true young body could not come out. His incarnation and some people in the lower realm were not restricted by this. Originally, with Qingjue Mountain guarding the place, even if these people came out, they would be dealt with or received. Now that the place was occupied by the demon division, it was up to them to decide how to go in and out. Michihito Ichido said, "This person is also a demon cultivator. He was once a disciple of my Dao. However, he is different from his kind. He does not want to become enemies with me, but he cannot go against the wishes of those demons. Therefore he ran out this time. I brought him here to hide." Zhang Yan thought for a while and said, "Fellow Taoist, you are willing to bring this person here and even take the risk of exposing your hiding place. Could it be that there is something on this person that is worth doing this?" Michihito Ichido smiled and said, "I can't hide it from you, fellow Taoist. Please follow me. You will know after talking to this person." Chapter 1674. Zhang Yan followed Taoist Yi into the inner room. When they arrived at a corridor, a servant came to lift the bamboo curtain under the eaves and led them into a secluded inner court. The place was filled with ancient pine and cypress trees and a sweet fragrance wafted in the air. As soon as they stepped into the room, they heard a heavy sound of zither. He looked over and saw an old man sitting there playing the zither. He wore gray clothes and had a square scarf tied around his head. He looked very focused. The servant was about to go up and call for him, but he was stopped by Michihito Ichido, who said, "It's rare for this person to play the zither. Just listen here." Zhang Yan listened for a while, and he could tell that there was a profound artistic conception in this person's music, and there were some wonderful principles in it. This person should have been deeply immersed in this path, but due to his cultivation he couldn't perform the true meaning of it. However, the zither music was extraordinary. If a junior cultivator heard it, they would definitely benefit a lot from it. But to them, it was only a pleasant sound. It was just that because of his background, Michihito Ichido often played in the human world. This might be his hobby, so he also stopped here. In fact, from his point of view, this could be considered a good thing. This non-human cultivator was willing to stand up this time, and there was probably a reason behind it. Not long after, the old man finished playing, and he realized that Michihito Ichido and Zhang Yan were standing there. He hurriedly got up and bowed, and he secretly looked at Zhang Yan. After a short pause, he said, "I'm rude, and I've neglected the two supreme venerables." Michihito Ichido waved his sleeve and smiled. "It's fine. I was fortunate enough to hear the song of floating mist when I was in Bhutan, and I didn't expect to hear it again today. It's worth stopping for this. The old man said with shame, my cultivation is not good enough, and I'm far from my teacher. I'm afraid that this kind of sound will pollute the two Yuanzun's ears. Michihito Ichido shook his head and said, being able to play this sound at your level is already not bad. If it were me, I wouldn't be able to do it either. He turned around and said to Zhang Yan, this is Gu Tuo. Even though he's a demon cultivator, his heart is one of humanity, and he's never done any evil deeds. Ever since he started cultivating, he hasn't harmed a single life. He then pointed at Zhang Yan and said, this is High Exalted Zhang. Gu Tuo hurriedly bowed again and said, greetings, Exalted Lord Zhang. Fellow Taoist Zhang, this person was originally an old turtle with a long lifespan, so he knows a lot about Bushutian's past. Apart from some secrets, if you have any questions, you can ask him. Taoist Yi transmitted his voice to Zhang Wuji through his divine will. Zhang Yan glanced at Gu Tuo and made a slight deduction, yet he didn't sense anything unusual from Gu Tuo, so he said, there's no need for formalities. When Gu Tuo straightened up, he asked again, I heard that you were originally cultivating at Bushutian's place. How did you come out this time? Gu Tuo said respectfully, it's not a difficult matter. Even though the Great Exalted is harsh to human cultivators, he's very lenient to demon cultivators. I'm originally a demon, and it just so happened that the higher-ups were gathering all the demon divisions to establish a court, so I volunteered to go out and do some meritorious deeds. The Great Exalted Lord saw that I'm quite knowledgeable, so they allowed me to go out to the outer world. Zhang Yan didn't ask him what the true intentions of those innate demons were. Gu Tuo couldn't possibly know. Taking a step back, if he really knew some secrets, those demons wouldn't have let him out. He said, from what you said, it seems like there are still human cultivators in Bushutian? Gu Tuo hesitated for a while and said, there are still some, but they're all under the Great Exalted Lords. Oh, Zhang Yan said, is there such a person coming out this time? Gu Tuo said, reporting to the Great Exalted Lord, I don't know much about this. Zhang Yan came down and asked a few more questions, but as long as it was related to the innate demons and Bushutian's arrangements, Gu Tuo said he couldn't say anything. It wasn't that he was trying to evade, but every cultivator that came out from Bushutian had a chi dynamic restriction placed on them. Their memories were also sealed, so they couldn't say anything. Zhang Yan also knew this in his heart. Those demons could let people out so easily, so they must have prepared a defensive method. Even if Gu Tuo could really say a thing or two, because there was no way to verify it, Zhang Yan would not completely believe it. Michihito Ichido said, Tao friend Gu, you said before that a Great Exalted Lord asked you to bring something out. Now that Tao friend Zhang and I are here, you can take it out. Gu Tuo hurriedly said, let me try. Michihito Ichido said to Zhang Yan, although this treasure is with him, he doesn't know where he hid it. Previously he wanted to hand it to me, but no matter how I tried to activate it, it was useless. After telling me about this, I judged that this treasure should be related to human path cultivators. I'm not a human body, so it's useless. Now that Tao friend Zhang is here, I believe you can use it. Gu Tuo concentrated for a long time. Suddenly, a ray of light gathered in the void, then a flag appeared. It looked like it was weaved by clouds and ice, and there were wisps of mist floating outside. When he saw this item, he sighed and said, Two Great Exalted Lords, this is it. Zhang Yan took the small flag. As soon as he held it in his hand, he knew that it was called the God-dashing flag. As for what kind of power it had, it wasn't convenient to use it here, so he had to test it later. He turned around and asked, Tao friend Ig, can you remember the origin of this treasure? Michihito Ichido looked for a moment, then shook his head and said, I've never seen it. He paused for a moment, then said, if I see those precious treasures that are famous in the outside world, I'll definitely be able to see their origin. But if it's a treasure that's hidden, then I have no way of knowing. Zhang Yan could understand this as well. Cultivators would more or less keep some killing moves, because it was related to their lives. Even friends of the same path might not know about it. It seemed like this god-dashing flag was like that. Since it was so, it seemed like he couldn't deduce this person's identity from this. Chen Shi raised his head to look at Gu Tuo and said, "Why did that person give this treasure to fellow Taoist Gu?" Gu Tuo smiled bitterly and said, "I don't know as well. All those years ago, when that exalted being came to look for me, he only said that if the heavens and the earth changed in the future, then he could pass this treasure to Yuan Zun of the human Tao. I was indeed able to sense that this treasure was in my possession, but I've never seen it. It's just that I was deeply afraid of being seen through by those exalted beings, so I lived in seclusion after that, and I've only recently found an opportunity to come out." Michihito Ichido pondered deeply and said, "Looks like that fellow Taoist's ability isn't weak, and he made preparations for fellow Taoist Gu since the beginning. Otherwise, even if fellow Taoist Gu didn't appear before them, he would still have been seen through." Gu Tuo felt a wave of lingering fear when he heard this. If he was really noticed by those exalted beings, then he would absolutely not suffer a good end. After hiding this treasure for so many years, it wasn't that he hadn't wavered before. However, every time he was tempted, he would feel that once he did so, something bad would definitely happen. Thus he endured it. Zhang Yan thought for a while and said, "Fellow Taoist Gu, can you remember the name of that Yuan Zun?" Gu Tuo tried to recall, but he revealed a troubled expression and shook his head, reporting to exalted being Zhang, "I can't recall it now. I can only vaguely remember that this happened long before the great change in Busu Tian." Zhang Yan was just trying to ask, and he didn't expect to get a reply. In fact, it was normal for him to not have an answer. Michihito Ichido said, "Fellow Taoist Zhang, for this fellow Taoist to make such arrangements before the great change, perhaps he had foreseen this, or perhaps he was preparing for a rainy day. However, this is still a good thing for me." Zhang Yan nodded his head. Unless this matter was arranged by the Khanate demon, but just now he had already checked, and the possibility of this was extremely small. If this person wanted to do this, he could even hide from Michihito Ichido's senses. If he could really do this, then as long as he undid the formation, he could directly kill his way here. There was no need to go through so much trouble. However, out of cautiousness, he still said, "When fellow Taoist Danny arrives, we still need to ask him to identify it." Michihito Ichido agreed. Because Zhang Yan needed to test out the ability of the God-shaking heaven flag, he discussed with Michihito Ichido and found a secret place to take out the flag. With just a slight test, he roughly understood the profoundness of the flag. If this treasure was taken out, even a true yang cultivator's soul would be shaken, and it would be difficult for them to calmly control their own essence qi. Such a change should not be underestimated. During a battle, if things went wrong, they would not be able to achieve their goal, and it would be equivalent to giving the opponent a chance. It was a pity that if those supreme treasures did not fall into the hands of the Khanate demon, then perhaps this item alone would be enough to deal with this person. But now, it was very different. From this, it could be seen that this person actually did not know what changes would happen in the future. Maybe he only sensed that the monster cultivators were gradually rising, so he set up such a backup plan in advance. But no matter what, it was better than nothing. After waiting for a day, he suddenly sensed that Dan Yi had arrived, so he came out of the cave dwelling. The next moment, he appeared in front of the temple, and Michihito Ichido was already waiting there. After a while, a young man floated down from the sky. When his feet landed on the ground, he came in front of the two of them and bowed. Then he looked at Zhang Yan and said, "I didn't expect fellow Taoist Zhang to have already arrived, but I am late." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist came at the right time, I was just one step ahead of you." Michihito Ichido smiled and said, "How was your trip?" Dan Yi said in disappointment, "I still can't find the whereabouts of the two Taoists. I only found the cave dwellings that they left in the void primordial sea, but there is no aura at all. It's not like there is no shadow of the past and future that can be seen, so it is hard to know where the two Taoists went." Michihito Ichido said, "So it seems that the two Taoists might have fallen into the great change that happened back then." Although Dan Yi did not want to think so, but since he could not find them everywhere, this was the only possibility. He raised his head and said, "Let's not talk about this first. The Busu Tian Forbidden Formation is not far away from being dissolved, so we should discuss a detailed strategy." Michihito Ichido smiled and said, "There is no hurry. Fellow Taoist Zhang and I obtained a treasure not long ago. It was brought out from Busu Tian by another Taoist. We have already seen it, so we need to ask fellow Taoist Dan Yi to take a look. If there is no problem, then we will have one more treasure to help us in battle." You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.